The blood on the key was still wet when the boy held it out, and the man who took it had no idea he'd just signed his own death warrant. In a forgotten industrial town where factories rot like open wounds and children learn to run before they learn to read, a former Marine biker named Grim made the worst mistake of his life. He stopped. He listened. And now a corporate death squad is hunting a child through streets the police have already abandoned. What you're about to hear isn't a fairy tale. It's a war, fought on two wheels, in the dark, by men the world threw away. Stay with me until the very end. If this story hits you, smash that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Let's ride. The gas station sat crooked against the highway like a broken tooth no one had bothered to pull. Two pumps. One fluorescent light buzzing overhead, half the bulb dead, throwing a sick yellow glow across cracked concrete. The kind of place that smelled like diesel and regret and the slow decay of a town that stopped mattering 20 years ago. Elias Mercer, grim to anyone who'd ridden beside him long enough to earn the right, killed the engine on his bike and sat there for a moment, letting the silence fill in around him. The ride from the charity event had been 3 hours of cold wind and empty road, and his shoulders carried every mile. 41 years old, 2 combat tours, a marriage that ended in a kitchen at 2 in the morning with nothing left to throw. The kind of man who looked like he was always arriving somewhere he didn't want to be. He swung off the Harley and walked toward the station door, his boots grinding against loose gravel. The leather cut across his back bore the patch of the iron veil. No territory claimed, no empire built, just a handful of broken veterans who rode because sitting still was worse than dying. Road Captain. The title sounded official. In practice, it meant he was the one who stayed awake when everyone else slept, the one who checked the mirrors, the one who noticed things other people pretended not to see. Inside, the station smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner that hadn't cleaned anything in years. A teenage clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his phone. Grim paid for fuel in cash, grabbed a bottle of water, and headed back out into the cold. He was halfway to his bike when he realized his wallet was gone. Not stolen, dropped. The worn leather fold had slipped from his back pocket somewhere between the counter and the door. He turned, already annoyed at himself, and that's when the boy appeared. Small, 11, maybe 12, thin in the way kids get when meals aren't guaranteed. A hoodie 2 sizes too big, sleeves pulled past his knuckles, sneakers held together with something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite tape. He stood 10 feet away, holding the wallet out with one hand. "Sir," Grim stopped. "Your wallet wasn't the only thing they dropped." The voice was quiet, steady in a way that didn't match the trembling in his shoulders. Grim took the wallet, but his eyes never left the boy's other hand, the one clenched tight at his side, knuckles white, fingers locked around something he didn't want to hold but couldn't let go of. "What's your name, kid?" "Noah." "Noah what?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he slowly opened his fist. An old brass key sat in his palm, small, tarnished, the kind that belonged to a locker or a lockbox from another era. And across the teeth, smeared in a line that caught the yellow light like a warning, blood, fresh enough to still be wet at the edges. An engraving along the shaft, barely legible beneath the stain. Locker 218. Grim's chest tightened. Not fear. Something older, something trained into him in places where brass casings hit dirt floors and you learn to read danger the way other people read street signs. "Where'd you get this?" Noah's eyes darted past Grim's shoulder, toward the road, toward the darkness beyond the pumps. "They hurt my sister because she found it." The words landed like a round chambered in silence. Grim didn't move. The boy's breathing was shallow, rapid, the kind that comes from running too long on too little food and too much fear. Before Grim could ask another question, headlights swept across the lot. 2 black SUVs, tinted windows, rolling slow along the opposite side of the highway. Not passing through. Scanning. Noah saw them first. His whole body went rigid, and for 1 second his eyes, brown, too old for his face, locked onto Grim's with something that wasn't a plea. It was a transfer, a handing off, like he'd been carrying something too heavy and had finally found someone whose shoulders looked strong enough to hold it. Then he was gone, slipped into the gap between the station and a rusted dumpster, and vanished like smoke. The SUVs slowed. One of them stopped. Grim pocketed the key, walked to his bike, swung on, kicked the engine to life, and pulled out onto the highway heading east, keeping his speed even, his mirrors busy. The SUV didn't follow, not yet, but Grim had been hunted before. He knew the difference between being watched and being tracked. Tonight, he was both. 40 minutes later, he pulled into the gravel lot behind a roadhouse called the Rusted Spoke. Low ceiling, wood floors stained dark from years of spilled beer and boot traffic. The kind of place where the jukebox played songs nobody requested, and the bartender knew better than to ask questions. 3 bikes already sat out front. He recognized each one the way a soldier recognizes rifles in a rack, by the scars. Vince Calder sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Big man. Quiet in the way that large, dangerous men sometimes are when they've learned that silence protects more than fists. Former Army combat medic. 2 Purple Hearts he kept in a coffee can under his bathroom sink because the dresser drawer felt too much like a shrine. His hands, scarred across both sets of knuckles, rested flat on the bar top like he was keeping the whole building from floating away. Miles Rourke occupied the booth near the back wall, reading a paperback with the cover torn off. Lean, sharp-featured. A former intelligence analyst who'd left the service after a classified incident he never talked about and no one asked about twice. He wore wire-frame glasses that made him look like a librarian, which was useful because it made people underestimate him, and Miles had built an entire second career on being underestimated. Reese Dalton leaned against the pool table, rolling a quarter across his knuckles in a lazy, repetitive motion that looked casual but wasn't. Youngest of the group. 34. A former Marine Scout sniper who'd come home from his 3rd deployment to find his apartment empty, his dog at a shelter, and a note on the counter that said only, "I can't do this anymore." He hadn't spoken to anyone outside the club for 11 months after that. The quarter trick was a focus exercise his VA therapist taught him. He did it instead of the other things his hands sometimes wanted to do. Grim walked in and sat down without ordering. Vince looked at him. "You look like hell." "Feel like it too." Grim set the brass key on the bar. The blood caught the low light and the room shifted. Not in sound, but in weight. Vince's whiskey hand went still. Miles closed his book. Reese stopped rolling the quarter. "Kid gave me this at a gas station outside Harlan Ridge," Grim said. "Maybe 11 years old. Said someone hurt his sister over it." "Hurt how?" Vince asked. "Didn't get that far. Black SUVs showed up. Kid vanished." Miles leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Locker 218. That mean anything to anyone?" Silence. The jukebox switched songs. Something slow and tired. Reese picked up the key, turned it in his fingers, studied the engraving. Old railway key, pre-digital. These went to the depot storage lockers they used for cargo manifests and maintenance logs. Which depot? Only one in this area that ever had numbered lockers like this. The Creston Avenue Rail Yard, shut down 8 years ago. Reese set the key back on the bar. Scheduled for demolition next month. Some redevelopment outfit bought the whole block. Grim stared at the key. The blood had started to dry, turning from red to rust. "A kid doesn't run through the dark carrying a bloody key unless something worse is chasing him," he said quietly. "So what are you saying?" Vince asked. Grim met his eyes. "I'm saying I want to know what's in locker 218. And if it's trouble, then it's trouble." Vince held his gaze for 3 long seconds, then picked up his whiskey and drank it in one pull. He set the glass down hard enough to make the bartender look up. "All right," he said. "Let's go find out what somebody's willing to bleed a child over." They rode out at midnight, 4 bikes in a loose formation, headlights cutting through fog that rolled off the river like something alive. The road to the old rail yard wound through the industrial district. Blocks of shuttered factories, chain-link fences sagging under their own rust. Streetlights that hadn't worked since the last city budget decided this neighborhood wasn't worth the electricity. The Creston Avenue depot sat at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by a wall of corrugated metal and concrete barriers. The building itself was massive, a long, low structure of brick and iron, its windows shattered, its loading bays sealed with plywood that had started to rot. Weeds pushed through the platform cracks. A faded sign above the main entrance read, Creston Avenue Freight Terminal, in letters that had once been white. They cut their engines 50 yards out and walked the rest. Grim took point. Reese covered the perimeter. Vince and Miles moved through the main entrance, flashlights sweeping across a floor covered in broken glass, pigeon droppings, and the remains of a security office that had been stripped bare. The lockers were in the basement, rows of them, old steel units, most hanging open, empty, their locks long since broken or removed. The air down here was different, cold and damp, carrying the smell of standing water and corroded metal. Their flashlight beams moved across numbered plates, 201, 205, 210. Locker 218 sat at the end of the row, against the far wall. Unlike the others, its door was closed, and the lock, a heavy brass padlock, old but maintained, was intact. Grim held up the key. It fit. The lock opened with a sound like a bone cracking. Inside the locker, stacked neatly on a single shelf, were 3 encrypted hard drives, a leather-bound ledger thick with handwritten entries, a sealed envelope containing photographs, and a USB drive labeled in black marker with 2 words, Proof, Original. Miles pulled on gloves and opened the ledger first. His face changed as he read. Not shock. He'd spent years reading things that would make normal people stop sleeping. This was something else. Recognition. The slow understanding that a suspicion you'd carried for years had just been confirmed in someone else's handwriting. This is a financial record, he said quietly, going back at least 15 years. Land purchases, insurance claims, payouts to contractors, and names. He looked up. Names of people who disappeared. Vince moved closer. Disappeared how? Residents, small business owners, people who owned property in the redevelopment corridor. According to this, at least 19 of them were either forced out, paid off under threat, or simply... Miles turned a page. Removed. The words sat in the basement air like smoke. Reese checked the photographs. Surveillance shots, taken from high angles, rooftops, second-story windows. Men in suits, men in work clothes. Exchanges of envelopes. A body being loaded into the back of a van in what looked like a warehouse loading dock. Who owns this redevelopment project? Grim asked. Miles flipped to the front of the ledger. A business card was paperclipped to the inside cover. Clean, expensive stock, embossed lettering, Meridian Futures Development Corp. The name hit the room like a closed fist. Meridian Futures was the single largest private developer in the Tri-County area. Office towers, shopping centers, residential complexes. Their billboards lined every highway. Their CEO had shaken hands with the governor on television 6 months ago. They were the company that was supposed to save this dying town. And according to the contents of Locker 218, they had built their empire on the bones of the people they'd buried to get there. We need to put this back, Reese said, his voice tight. Right now. This isn't a bar fight or a charity run. This is federal-level corruption. We're standing in the middle of evidence that could bring down... A kid carried this key through the dark, covered in blood, Grim said. He didn't come to me because he had options. He came because he had nothing else. Grim. His sister found this. She tried to do the right thing, and they hurt her for it. Grim's voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it was moving, something that sounded like the mechanical engagement of a weapon. We don't walk away from that. Reese stared at him, then he exhaled and looked at the ceiling. Yeah, he said, I know we don't. They photographed everything, copied the drives, sealed the originals back in the locker and locked it. If anyone checked, it would look untouched. But the copies rode out of that depot in Grim's saddlebag, wrapped in a shop rag and sealed in a waterproof pouch. The ride back was silent. 4 engines in the dark, 4 men carrying the weight of something that had just changed the shape of the world they lived in. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Grim pulled off the highway at a truck stop outside Harlan Ridge, the same stretch of road where Noah had appeared. He killed the engine and sat in the cold, scanning the tree line, the drainage ditches, the shadows behind the dumpsters. Nothing. He was about to leave when a small shape moved behind the propane cage at the edge of the lot. Noah. The boy looked worse than before, exhausted. a bruise darkening along his jaw that hadn't been there hours ago. He was shivering, not from the cold, but from the kind of sustained fear that eats through a body the way acid eats through metal. Grim didn't approach. He knelt beside his bike and waited. Noah came to him, slowly, the way an animal approaches the first hand it's ever considered trusting. "You went to the depot," the boy said. Not a question. "Yeah." "Did you open it?" "Yeah." Noah's breath hitched. His eyes filled, but nothing fell. The kid had learned how to hold it in. That was the part that broke something inside Grim's chest. Not the tears, but the absence of them. The discipline of a child who'd been taught that crying made things worse. "My sister," Noah whispered. "She's hurt bad. She won't go to the hospital. She says they'll find her there." "Where is she?" The boy hesitated. Everything in his body said no. Every survival instinct he'd built in 11 years of living in a town that forgot him told him to run. But he didn't. "There's an old laundromat on Beckford Street. Closed down last year. She's in the back room. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. Grim pulled out his phone and called Vince. "I need you at a laundromat on Beckford. Bring the med kit. Bring food." He paused. "And bring something warm. She's a kid." "How old?" Vince asked. "I'll find out." He hung up and looked at Noah. "How old is your sister?" 17. Grim closed his eyes. 17. A teenager hiding in an abandoned building with injuries she was too afraid to have treated, holding a secret that had already drawn blood, while the most powerful corporation in the county hunted her through streets where the streetlights had been turned off, because nobody cared enough to keep them on. He thought about what Reese had said in the depot. Federal-level corruption. The kind of thing that involved lawyers and jurisdictions and months of investigations while witnesses went missing one by one. And he thought about Noah's face, the bruise on his jaw, the way the boy had handed over the key, not with hope, but with exhaustion. The last act of someone who'd run out of places to hide. "Noah?" The boy looked at him. "I need you to stay close to me tonight. Can you do that?" "Why?" Grim reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy wool blanket he kept rolled behind the seat. He handed it to the boy. "Because nobody else is coming." They found Lena Briggs in the back room of the laundromat on Beckford Street, curled on a pile of old towels behind a broken dryer. 17 years old. Dark hair matted with dried sweat and something darker. A gash along her left forearm, crudely bandaged with a torn strip of t-shirt that was soaked through. Her face was swollen on one side. Not from a fall. From a fist. Vince went to work immediately, cleaned the wound, applied butterfly closures, checked her pupils, her pulse, the color of her nail beds. Combat medic protocol, performed in the back of a dead laundromat at 3:30 in the morning with the same calm precision he'd used in field hospitals where the ceiling shook and the lights went out. "She needs stitches," he said quietly to Grim, "and antibiotics. This is at least 36 hours old." Lena watched them with eyes that held no trust. She didn't speak. She held Noah's hand and Noah held hers, and neither of them let go. "You're safe," Grim told her. She looked at him. At the leather cut. At the patches. At the road-worn boots and the scars on his knuckles, and the face of a man who had clearly seen the kind of violence that most people only read about. "No one is safe," she said. "Not anymore." He didn't argue. Because she was right. Grim pulled a chair from the corner and sat 3 feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough that she could breathe. "Tell me what happened." And Lena told him. 3 weeks ago, she had been walking home from her shift at a convenience store near the Creston rail yard. It was after midnight. She cut through the depot parking lot the way she always did. It saved 10 minutes, and 10 minutes mattered when you were 17 and walking alone in a neighborhood where the police responded to calls about 40% of the time. She heard shouting, saw men, 3 of them, dragging someone across the loading dock. The man was bleeding. She couldn't see his face. One of the men hit him with something heavy, and the sound it made was the sound she heard every night when she closed her eyes. She should have run. She knew that. Every rational part of her brain screamed at her to turn around and disappear, but the victim dropped something. A key. It skittered across the concrete and stopped 3 feet from where she was hiding behind a support column. She grabbed it. She didn't know why. Instinct, stupidity, some part of her that believed evidence mattered, that someone would care. She ran. They saw her. 2 days later, men came to the apartment she shared with Noah and their grandmother. They didn't knock. They broke the lock. Grandma wasn't home. She was at the hospital for dialysis, the twice-weekly ritual that kept her alive and kept the apartment empty at predictable intervals. They searched everything, found nothing. Lena had hidden the key in Noah's school backpack, the one place she knew no adult would think to look. When they couldn't find it, they hit her, asked questions she refused to answer, then they left, promising to come back. Lena sent Noah away, told him to run and not come back until she called. She hid. Moved from building to building, sleeping in doorways and behind commercial dumpsters, too afraid to go to the police because 2 of the men she'd seen at the depot wore badges. Badges, Grimm repeated. Lena nodded. Not uniforms, but badges on their belts, like detectives. Or private security that wants to look like detectives. Miles, standing by the door with his arms crossed, spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. Meridian Futures has a private security division, licensed through the state, run by a man named Victor Hale. The name landed in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Hale was military, Miles continued, his voice flat and precise. Special operations, discharged under circumstances that were classified and then conveniently lost. He's been running Meridian Security for 6 years. Before that, he did contract work overseas, the kind that doesn't appear on any public record. Miles removed his glasses and cleaned them with a deliberate slowness. He's not a security chief. He's a cleaner. And if he's the one running this operation, then these kids aren't just in danger. They're on a list. Grimm looked at Lena, at the bandage on her arm, at the swelling on her face, at the way she held her brother's hand like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to smoke. He thought about walking away. For exactly 1 second, he thought about it, about putting the key back in Noah's hand and riding east until the road ran out and the ocean started and none of this was his problem anymore. Then he looked at Noah. The boy wasn't watching him. He was watching his sister, watching her breathe, counting each inhale the way you count when you're afraid the next one might not come. Grimm stood up. Vince, get them somewhere clean, somewhere with a door that locks and heat that works. Use the cabin. The cabin's 40 minutes north. Then you'd better ride fast. Vince didn't argue. He gathered the med supplies, helped Lena to her feet, and wrapped the wool blanket around Noah's shoulders. At the door, he paused. What are you going to do? Grimm picked up the brass key from the counter where he'd set it. The blood had dried completely now. Rust-colored, permanent. I'm going to find out who Victor Hale is afraid of, he said. Because a man who sends 3 people to beat a 17-year-old girl over a key isn't at the top of the chain. He's at the end of a leash. The laundromat door closed behind Vince and the children. The room went quiet. Just Grimm, Miles, and Reese standing in a dead building surrounded by dead machines in a dead part of town. Miles spoke first. You know what we're walking into? Yeah. An entire corporate infrastructure designed to eliminate threats, private military contractors, compromised local law enforcement, unlimited funding. Miles put his glasses back on. And us. 4 men with motorcycles and a copy of a ledger. Reese leaned against the wall. 5, if the girl testifies. She's 17 and terrified. She's 17 and she grabbed evidence off a crime scene while 3 men beat a man in front of her, Reese said quietly. That's not terrified. That's brave. And brave is the only thing we've got right now. Grimm turned the key in his fingers. The brass was warm from his grip. He could still feel the ghost of Noah's palm against it, the heat of a child's hand pressed around something too heavy for any child to carry. Hale will come for them, Grimm said. Tonight, tomorrow, next week. It doesn't matter when. He'll come. And when he does, he'll make them disappear the way he made 19 other people disappear. He set the key on the counter. Unless we're standing in the way. Outside, the wind picked up off the river, carrying the smell of rust and cold water and the low, distant rumble of something none of them could name. Grimm's phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from an unknown number, 4 words. We know who you are. And below it, a photograph. Vince's bike, parked outside the cabin. taken from across the road. 30 minutes ago. They had already found the children. Grimm stared at the photograph on his phone for exactly 4 seconds. That was all the time he allowed himself. 4 seconds to register the image, Vince's bike, the cabin's porch light, the angle of the shot suggesting a vehicle parked across the road with a telephoto lens, and 4 seconds to bury every emotion that tried to surface beneath the cold operational logic that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours and a decade of nightmares. He turned the phone toward Miles and Reese. Nobody spoke. Miles took the phone, studied the image, then handed it back with a single nod. The kind of nod that meant he'd already cataloged the metadata, estimated the lens distance, and begun constructing a threat profile in the quiet, terrifying architecture of his mind. Reese just pushed off the wall. His hand went to his belt. Not for a weapon. For the quarter. He rolled it once, twice, then pocketed it. "Call Vince," Reese said. Grimm was already dialing. 1 ring, 2, 3. Vince picked up on the 4th. "We're inside, doors locked, heat works." A pause. "Kids are eating. You need to move." The quality of Vince's silence changed. It went from casual to tactical in less than a heartbeat. The shift of a man who'd spent years in field hospitals, where the difference between a quiet ward and an incoming mortar was exactly that kind of pause. "How fast?" "Right now. Someone photographed your bike from across the road 30 minutes ago." Grimm heard Vince exhale, heard the creak of floorboards as he moved, heard, faintly, Noah's voice asking a question and Lena's telling him to be quiet. "There's a maintenance trail behind the property," Vince said, his voice dropping to the low, even register he used when things were about to go very wrong. "Comes out on Route 9 near the old sawmill. I can have them in the truck bed in 2 minutes." "Truck?" "Borrowed one. Bike's too exposed with 2 passengers. Figured that out about 10 minutes before you did." Grimm almost smiled. Almost. "Get them to the motel on Granger Road. Room under a name nobody knows. Pay cash. Stay off your phone after this call." "Copy." The line went dead. Grimm pocketed the phone and looked at Miles. How did they find the cabin? Miles leaned against the laundromat's folding table, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the middle distance the way they always were when he was running calculations behind them. 3 possibilities. 1, they followed Vince from here. Unlikely. He's too experienced and the roads north are empty enough to spot a tail. 2, they were already watching the cabin. Possible if they've mapped our known properties, but the cabin isn't in Vince's name. It's in his ex-wife's mother's name, and she's been dead 4 years. 3? Miles removed his glasses, held them up to the light, put them back on. "Someone told them." The words hit the room like a door slamming. Reese straightened. Grimm's jaw tightened. A micro-movement, barely visible, but Miles caught it because Miles caught everything. "No," Grimm said. "I'm not accusing anyone in this room, but we need to acknowledge the possibility that our circle is not as sealed as we assumed." Miles's voice carried no emotion. It never did when he was working. That was what made it so unsettling. "The Iron Veil has 11 active members. Tonight, 4 of us are involved. That leaves 7 who know nothing about the key, the children, or Locker 218. But they know our routes, they know our properties, and they know our patterns. Nobody in the Veil would sell us out. People don't sell each other out because they're evil, Grimm. They do it because they're pressured, threatened, leveraged." Miles paused. "Or because they've been compromised so slowly they don't even realize they're leaking," Reese spoke from the corner. "He's not wrong." Grimm turned. "Don't look at me like that," Reese said. "I trust every man in this club with my life. I've done it before and I'll do it again. But trust and certainty are 2 different animals, and right now we're making decisions about children based on certainty we don't have." The silence that followed was the kind that lives between brothers who've bled together, heavy with respect and sharp with the understanding that loyalty doesn't make anyone bulletproof. Grimm walked to the laundromat's front window and looked out at the empty street. A streetlight 2 blocks away flickered, throwing a pulse of orange light across wet pavement. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, nothing at all. "All right," he said without turning around. "From this point forward, nobody outside this room knows anything. Not where the kids are, not what we found, not what we're planning. The rest of the Veil stays dark until I say otherwise." That's going to cause problems, Reese said. Good. Problems I can handle. A dead 17-year-old I can't. They split up at 4 in the morning. Miles went east to run the encrypted drives through a contact he had at a digital forensics lab. Someone who owed him a favor from a previous life and asked no questions. Reese went north to set up counter-surveillance on the roads leading to Vince's new location. Grimm rode alone. He didn't go to the motel. Not yet. He went to the only place in Harlan Ridge that was still open at 4:15 in the morning, a diner called Glass House, named either for its floor-to-ceiling windows or the fragility of everything inside, depending on who you asked. He sat in a booth facing the door, ordered coffee he didn't intend to drink, and pulled up every piece of public information he could find on Meridian Futures Development Corp. The company's website was clean, professional, the kind of digital architecture that costs 6 figures and says absolutely nothing. Headshots of executives with practiced smiles, renderings of planned communities that looked like they'd been designed by people who'd never actually lived in a community. Press releases about economic revitalization and civic partnerships and phrases like investing in tomorrow's landscape. The CEO was a man named Garrett Pembroke. 62, silver hair. The face of a man who'd learned to look compassionate the way other people learn to play piano, through repetition and muscle memory, not feeling. He'd been profiled in regional business magazines. He'd donated to hospitals. He'd attended fundraisers for veterans' causes, which made Grimm's stomach turn in a way he couldn't fully articulate. And beneath Pembroke, listed under corporate security and risk management, was a name with no photograph. Victor Hale, director. No bio, no headshot. Just a name and a title, which told Grimm more than any profile could. Men who don't want to be seen are either hiding or hunting. Hale was both. The coffee arrived. Grimm wrapped his hands around the mug and stared at the steam rising off the surface. His reflection looked back at him, fractured, incomplete, older than he remembered. He thought about the photograph on his phone, Vince's bike, the cabin, the 30-minute window. Miles was right. Someone had fed them information. Not necessarily from the veil. There were other possibilities. The gas station had cameras. Grimm's plates were registered. If Hale had access to law enforcement databases, and Lena's account suggested he did, then tracing Grimm's identity was straightforward. From there, mapping his known associates, his club affiliations, his property records, all of it was accessible to anyone with the right clearance or the right bribe. But that explanation was convenient, and in Grimm's experience, convenient explanations were the ones that got people killed. His phone rang at 5:12, an unknown number again. He answered. Mr. Mercer. The voice was calm, cultured, the kind of voice that belonged in a boardroom, not a phone call to a biker at a roadside diner. My name is Victor Hale. I believe you have something that belongs to my employer. Grimm said nothing. The key. The contents of locker 218, and 2 minors who are currently under your protection. A pause. I'd like to resolve this efficiently. Efficiently. Without additional harm. Additional. Grimm's voice was flat. That word's doing a lot of heavy lifting. I understand you're a veteran, Mr. Mercer. I respect that. I'm a veteran myself. We both know that sometimes situations escalate beyond anyone's original intention. What happened to the girl was regrettable. A miscalculation by men who have already been disciplined. Disciplined. Terminated, if you prefer. Their employment, Mr. Mercer. Not their lives. I'm not the monster the girl has made me out to be. Grimm watched a truck pull into the diner lot, its headlights sweeping across the windows. Just a driver looking for coffee. Not a threat. Probably. What do you want, Hale? The evidence returned, all copies. The original drives and the ledger. In exchange, the children are left alone, permanently. You have my word. Your word. I know what that sounds like, but consider your alternatives. You go to the police, half of whom are on my payroll, though you probably already suspect that. You go to the feds, which takes months, during which time witnesses have a way of becoming unreachable. Or you try to protect these children yourself with, forgive me, 4 men and a motorcycle club that collects donations for children's hospitals. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm offering you a clean exit, Mr. Mercer. For everyone. Grimm set the coffee down. His hand was steady. It was always steady when the worst part of him was waking up. You beat a 17-year-old girl in her own home. As I said, you sent men to a child's apartment while her grandmother was at dialysis, because you knew the schedule, because you'd been watching them. Grimm's voice dropped. Not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that Vince once described as the sound Grimm makes right before things stop being conversations. You broke her lock. You hit her in the face. And then you told her you'd come back. Mr. Mercer. And now you're calling me at 5 in the morning to explain that it was a miscalculation, that the men who did it have been disciplined, that you're not a monster. Grimm paused. But you're calling from an unknown number at 5 in the morning, which means you're awake right now, which means you're in an operations room somewhere running a board with our names and faces on it, and you've been doing it all night. Silence. I don't negotiate with men who beat children, Hale. I never have, and I'm not starting tonight. Then you're making a mistake. I've made plenty. This isn't one of them. The line went dead. Grimm set the phone on the table and exhaled. His hands were still steady, but his chest felt like someone had filled it with concrete. He flagged the waitress and ordered a second coffee. When it arrived, he drank it. It tasted like nothing. At 6:30, the sun came up. Not bright, not warm, just a gray light that spread across the diner windows like dishwater. Grimm paid his tab and rode to the motel on Granger Road. Vince was sitting on the floor outside room 14, his back against the wall, a thermos of coffee between his knees. He looked like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't. The med kit sat beside him, open, its contents reorganized with the compulsive neatness of a man who needed control over something small because everything large had gone sideways. Kids? Grimm asked. Asleep, both of them. Lena's wound is clean, but she's running a low fever. I gave her the last of the antibiotics from my kit, but she needs a real prescription. I'll figure it out. Grimm. Vince looked up. What are we doing? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was loaded with the specific gravity of a man who'd spent 14 years cleaning up after violence, stitching flesh, stopping bleeding, holding soldiers' hands while they died in places whose names were classified, and who recognized the particular architecture of a situation where everyone involved was about to get hurt. We're protecting 2 kids who don't have anyone else. From a private military operation with limitless resources. Yeah. With 4 men. 5. Lena's a witness. She's 17. She grabbed a key off a crime scene while 3 men beat a man to death 10 feet from her. Grimm sat down across from Vince, his back against the opposite wall. The hallway was narrow, their boots almost touched. She's braver than most people I served with. Vince was quiet for a long time. He picked up the thermos, poured coffee into the cap, and handed it to Grimm. You know why I ride with you, Vince said. Because your ex-wife took the car. Vince almost laughed. The ghost of a smile crossed his face and disappeared into the beard he'd been growing since the divorce. A beard that had started as laziness and become a wall. Because you're the only man I've ever met who makes stupid decisions for the right reasons. He paused. But this isn't a bar fight, Grimm. This isn't riding escort for a funeral or sitting outside a shelter until the ex-husband stops circling the block. This is a corporate death machine that's been operating for 15 years and has already killed at least 19 people. We don't even know if the evidence is real. It's real. How do you know? Because they sent 3 men to beat a teenage girl over a key, because they photographed your bike within an hour of us moving the children, because Victor Hale called me at 5 this morning and offered me a clean exit. Grimm drank the coffee. It was cold. He didn't care. Nobody offers a clean exit unless the exit they're planning is dirty. Vince looked at the ceiling. Reese wants to take the evidence to the feds directly, cut out the local PD entirely. Miles is against it. Miles is against everything that involves trusting institutions. Miles watched an institution cover up a massacre and promote the man who ordered it. He gets to be against institutions. The motel's ice machine hummed down the hall. A door opened somewhere and closed again. The ordinary sounds of a world that was still functioning normally while everything inside room 14 was held together by butterfly closures and borrowed blankets. There's something else, Vince said. His voice changed, dropped half a register. The frequency shift that meant he was about to say something he'd been holding. Grim waited. When I was driving them here, the truck, back roads, no lights, Noah talked. Not a lot, but enough. Vince's jaw worked. He said the men who came to the apartment, they weren't the first time. He said men like that had come before, months ago, different men, asking about their grandmother. Their grandmother? She owns the apartment, has for 30 years, and the apartment building sits on a parcel of land inside the Meridian redevelopment corridor. Vince met Grim's eyes. They weren't after the key first, Grim. They were after the property. Lena finding the key just made it worse, but this started before the depot. This started with a sick old woman who wouldn't sell. The hallway went very quiet. Grim felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger, not yet, but the precursor to anger. The tectonic movement that happens before the ground splits open. A grandmother on dialysis. 2 grandchildren living in a building someone wanted to demolish. Pressure applied slowly at first. Paperwork, notices, offers that weren't really offers. And when that failed, men who weren't really asking. The key hadn't started this. The key had just revealed what was already happening. Grim stood up. I'm going to talk to Lena. She's asleep. Then I'll wait. He sat in the plastic chair outside room 14 for 45 minutes. The sun climbed higher, turning the motel's parking lot into a grid of long shadows and cracked asphalt. A maid came and went. A family in a minivan checked out. The world moved at the pace of people who weren't being hunted. When the door opened, it was Noah. The boy looked at Grim with that same impossible steadiness. The eyes of a child who'd already learned that adults couldn't be trusted but was choosing to try one more time anyway. She's awake. She says she'll talk to you. Grim went inside. The room was small. 2 beds, a TV bolted to a dresser. A window covered by curtains that hadn't been updated since the 90s. Lena sat on the far bed with her back against the headboard, her injured arm resting in her lap. The swelling on her face had darkened overnight. Purple and green now, the colors of a bruise finding its final form. She watched Grim sit down in the chair by the desk. She didn't greet him. She didn't smile. She waited the way people wait when they've learned that the first person to speak usually has something to sell. Hale called me this morning, Grim said. Lena's expression didn't change, but her uninjured hand tightened on the bedspread. He wants the evidence back. All of it. He says if we return everything, he'll leave you and Noah alone. And you believe him? No? Good. Her voice was hoarse, dry. The voice of someone who hadn't spoken above a whisper in days. Because the last man who believed Victor Hale was the man I watched them beat in the parking lot. You saw his face? Lena looked away. Toward the curtain window. The light coming through was thin and gray, and it caught the bruise on her cheek in a way that made it look like a map of somewhere painful. His name was Tom Everett. He was a building inspector. He'd been quietly documenting structural violations in the properties Meridian was buying, buildings they were deliberately letting deteriorate so they could condemn them faster. He kept records. Paper records, because he didn't trust digital. And he kept them in locker 218 because it was the one place nobody would look. She paused. Until somebody did. Is he alive? Lena's silence was its own answer. Noah, sitting cross-legged on the other bed, pulled his knees to his chest. They put him in a van, Lena said finally. I heard him stop making sounds. That's when I ran. Grim leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor. The carpet was industrial beige, the kind that hides stains. He thought about Tom Everett, a building inspector, a man who kept paper records because he didn't trust digital, a man who believed that documentation was protection, that evidence was armor, that the truth was a shield. He'd been wrong. The truth wasn't a shield. The truth was a target on your back, and Tom Everett had carried it until someone decided he'd carried it long enough. Lena, if we take this evidence to the federal authorities, and I mean federal, not local, not state, are you willing to testify about what you saw? The girl looked at him. Her eyes were dark and clear and carried the specific weight of someone who had watched a man die and then walked home alone through empty streets at midnight and hadn't told anyone because there was no one to tell. "If I testify," she said, "they'll kill my grandmother. We can protect—" "You can't. You're 4 men on motorcycles. They're an army." The words hung in the room like gun smoke. Grim didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He let them sit there because she'd earned the right to say them, and he'd earned the obligation to hear them. His phone buzzed. A text from Miles. "Drive's decrypted. It's worse than we thought. Call me on a landline." Grim looked at the motel phone on the nightstand. Analog. Hardwired. The kind of phone that didn't have GPS and couldn't be remotely accessed. He dialed Miles' contact number from memory. Miles answered on the first ring. His voice was different, tighter, compressed, like someone had wound a string around his throat and was slowly pulling. "The drives contain video," Miles said. 14 files. Surveillance footage from cameras hidden in the depot and surrounding properties. They show everything. The land intimidation visits, the bribery meetings, the assault on Tom Everett. A breath. And they show 2 police detectives present at 3 separate incidents. One of them is a precinct captain. Grim closed his eyes. There's more. The financial ledger cross-references payments to a shell company that funnels money to a city council member. The same council member who approved the Meridian redevelopment permits. How high does this go? High enough that going to the feds might not be enough. We'd need the right office, the right agent, someone who isn't connected to anyone in this county's power structure. Miles paused. And there's one more thing. The ledger contains a list of 13 properties still targeted for acquisition. 7 of those properties are occupied by elderly residents who've refused to sell. Lena's grandmother's building. Number 9 on the list. Grim looked at Lena. She was watching him with the expression of someone who already knew what he was hearing. Not the details, but the weight of it. The specific gravity of a truth that was bigger than any single person could carry. Miles, is there enough to bring them down? If we get it to the right people? Yes. This is 20 years' worth of evidence. Murders, fraud, corruption, conspiracy. This isn't a local crime story. This is a federal RICO case. Miles's voice shifted. But Grim, Hale knows we have copies. The moment he's certain we won't deal, he'll move to eliminate every witness, every piece of physical evidence, every person who's touched that key. How much time do we have? Based on his operational pattern, 48 hours, maybe less. He'll need to scrub the depot before the demolition crew arrives, destroy any remaining originals, and neutralize anyone who can connect the evidence to Meridian. Neutralize. His word, not mine. It appeared in an internal memo on one of the drives. He's used it 6 times in correspondence over the past 3 years. Each time, the person referenced in the memo disappeared within the following month. The motel room felt smaller, the walls closer, the gray light through the curtains thinner. Grim hung up and sat very still. Lena watched him. Noah watched him. The room waited. How bad? Lena asked. Bad enough that they've killed before. Bad enough that they'll kill again. Grim stood. Bad enough that the police are part of it, and the city council approved the cover. Lena's breath caught. Not a gasp. A stoppage. The kind that happens when the body processes information before the mind is ready to accept it. So there's nobody, she said. There's us. You. She almost laughed. The sound was bitter and exhausted and 17 years old. 4 bikers and a bloody key. 5, Noah said from the other bed. Everyone looked at him. The boy's face was pale but set. His jaw, still bruised from whoever had hit him at the gas station lot, was clenched in a way that made him look like a smaller, sharper version of someone who'd already decided. 5, he repeated. I count 2. Grim looked at the boy. 11 years old, 90 pounds in wet clothes, a bruise on his jaw and a backpack that had hidden a dead man's key. A boy who'd walked through the dark to hand evidence to a stranger because every system designed to protect him had failed. Yeah, Noah, Grim said. You count. His phone buzzed again. Reese this time. 3 SUVs just past Route 9 heading toward Harlan Ridge. Tinted windows, moving in formation. They're not searching anymore. They're deploying. And then a second message, 30 seconds later. Grim. I spotted something at the cabin. Before I left, boot prints in the mud behind the tree line, multiple sets. They were already there when Vince arrived. They weren't following us. They were waiting. Grim read the message twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. They hadn't followed Vince to the cabin. They were already positioned before the children arrived, which meant they'd known about the cabin before tonight, which meant they had information about the Iron Vale's safe houses that predated the key, predated Noah, predated everything, which meant Miles was right. Someone inside their world had been talking long before a boy appeared at a gas station with blood on his hands. Grim pocketed the phone and walked to the window. He pulled the curtain an inch and looked out at the parking lot. Empty, quiet, just asphalt and shadow and the cold morning light of a town that had given up pretending it was safe. Behind him, Lena said, "You know you can't win this." He let the curtain fall. "I know," he said, "but I don't need to win. I just need to get the evidence to someone who can, and I need to keep you alive long enough for that to matter." He opened the motel room door and stepped into the hallway. Vince was still there, sitting against the wall, the thermos empty, his eyes carrying the flat, professional exhaustion of a man who'd been awake for 26 hours and would stay awake for 26 more if that's what it took. "We're compromised," Grim said. Vince's eyes sharpened. "Someone knew about the cabin before we used it. Hale's people were already in position. That means they have intelligence on us that goes beyond tracing plates and pulling records. You think it's internal. I think I don't know. And not knowing is the most dangerous thing in the world right now." Vince stood slowly. His knees popped. His hand went to his lower back. An old injury, shrapnel from a mortar that had killed 2 men standing next to him and left him with a piece of metal the surgeons decided was safer to leave in than to take out. "What do you want to do?" "I want to move the kids again. New location. Somewhere only you and I know. Not Miles. Not Reese." The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that forms between 2 men who trust each other absolutely and have just been forced to acknowledge that trust has limits when lives are at stake. You're cutting the others out. Temporarily. Miles will take it as an accusation. Miles will take it as operational security. He'll be angry, but he'll understand. He'd do the same thing. And Reese? Grim hesitated. Just for a moment, but Vince saw it. "Reese has been clean for 8 months, Vince said carefully. "He's stable. He's focused. Whatever you're thinking, I'm not thinking anything about Reese except that I need to control the information flow until I know where the leak is. That's not suspicion. That's math." Vince studied his face. Looking for the lie. Looking for the doubt. Looking for the thing underneath the words that Grim wasn't saying. "All right," Vince said finally. "Where do we take them?" "My mother's house." Vince blinked. "Your mother's been dead for 6 years. The house hasn't. It's in a trust under a lawyer's name. Property taxes paid automatically. No connection to the Vale, no connection to my riding name, no connection to anything that comes up in a database search." Grim pulled the key to the house from a chain around his neck. A small silver key he'd worn since the funeral, pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. "Nobody knows about it. Not even Miles." "Why not?" Grim looked at him. "Because some things are too personal to be operational." Vince held his gaze. Then he nodded. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. The recognition that a man who carries a dead mother's house key against his skin for 6 years is a man who has built walls even his brothers haven't climbed. They moved Lena and Noah within the hour. Vince drove the borrowed truck. Grim rode ahead, scouting the roads, checking each intersection, watching the mirrors the way he'd watched them in convoys through territories where the roadside was the last place you looked, and the first place the danger hid. The house was small, white clapboard, a porch with a swing that had rusted in place, a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the spices his mother had cooked with, cumin and garlic and something else, something he could never name, something that was just her. He hadn't been inside in 18 months. The last time he'd sat on the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning and cried for 2 hours, the kind of crying that comes out of the body like something being pulled from deep underground, painful and necessary and impossible to stop once it starts. Nobody knew about that either. He opened the door and the smell hit him, and he held his breath for 3 seconds, and then he let it in. It's clean, he said. There's canned food in the pantry. Blankets in the hall closet, lock works, windows are solid. Lena walked inside slowly, Noah at her side. She looked around the small living room, the faded couch, the bookshelf full of paperback mysteries, the framed photograph on the mantel of a woman with Grimm's eyes, and a smile that suggested she'd survived things that would have broken weaker people. "Your mother?" Lena asked. Grimm didn't answer. He set the keys on the kitchen counter and checked the back door. "Stay away from the windows. Don't use the lights in the front rooms after dark. There's a landline in the kitchen. Use it only to call me. Not Vince, not anyone else." He turned to leave. "Mr. Mercer." Lena's voice stopped him at the door. He turned. She stood in the middle of his dead mother's living room, 17 years old, one arm bandaged, one side of her face purple, holding her brother's hand. "If I testify," she said, "if I tell them everything I saw, will it be enough? I don't know. Will they believe me? Some of them. Will I be safe?" Grimm looked at her, at the girl who'd grabbed a key from a crime scene while a man was beaten to death in front of her, at the girl who'd hidden in abandoned buildings for days rather than lead the killers to her brother, at the girl who stood in a stranger's dead mother's house and asked if she would be safe, knowing the answer was no, but needing to hear someone say something that sounded like the truth. "No," he said, "you won't be safe. Not until this is over. Maybe not after, but you'll be alive. And the people who did this to you will be in cells, and your brother will grow up in a world where someone fought for him." He paused. "That's what I can offer. It's not enough, but it's real." Lena held his gaze for a long time. Then she nodded once, the smallest possible movement, a gesture so restrained it was almost invisible, but it carried the weight of a decision that would change every life in the room. "Okay," she said, "I'll testify." Grimm walked out of his mother's house and closed the door behind him. He stood on the porch in the cold morning air, and the wind carried the smell of frozen grass and old wood, and the ghosts of meals that would never be cooked again. His phone rang. Reese. "Grimm, the SUVs I tracked. They didn't go to Harlan Ridge. They turned south, toward Granger Road." Grimm stopped breathing. "They're heading for the motel." The motel they'd left 40 minutes ago. The room that was now empty but still registered under a name that Vince had chosen at random and paid for in cash. A room that, if searched, would reveal nothing, unless it wasn't the room they were after. "Reese, the motel clerk. When Vince checked in, did the clerk see the kids?" Silence. Then, "Yeah, he did. He held the door for them." Grimm closed his eyes. A motel clerk. A minimum wage witness who'd seen a large man in a motorcycle cut walk in with two bruised, frightened children at 4 a.m. The kind of witness who would talk to anyone who asked the right questions and offered the right amount. "Get to the motel, now, not for the room, for the clerk." What am I doing? Getting him out before Hale's people get the name Vince used in the direction the truck went. And if I'm too late? Grimm gripped the porch railing. The wood was cold and rough under his palm, and somewhere inside the house behind him, a 17-year-old girl who'd just agreed to testify against a corporate murder machine was sitting in a dead woman's kitchen with her 11-year-old brother, eating canned soup and wondering if the man who'd just promised her survival was capable of delivering it. "Then we're out of time," Grimm said, "and everything we do next happens in the dark." The line went dead. The wind picked up, and somewhere south, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows were pulling into a motel parking lot, carrying men who had already killed for less than a brass key, and who were about to discover that the children they were hunting had vanished again, leaving behind nothing but an empty room and a trail that led straight toward the one place Grimm had sworn no one would ever find. Reese was 17 minutes too late. He found the motel clerk in the back office behind the front desk, sitting in a swivel chair that had been turned to face the wall. The man's hands were zip-tied to the armrests. His mouth was taped. His left eye was swollen shut. A fresh impact, 20 minutes old at most, the kind of controlled violence that comes from training, not rage. Professional, efficient. The mark of someone who understood that pain was a tool and that the right amount, applied to the right location, produced results faster than any question. The clerk was breathing. That was the first thing Reese checked. Shallow, rapid, The kind of breathing that comes after the body has processed a trauma the mind hasn't caught up to yet. Reese pulled the tape carefully. Not fast, not gentle, just efficient, the way he did everything. And the clerk gasped like a man surfacing from deep water. "How many?" Reese asked. "3." The clerk's voice was wrecked. Hoarse, swallowed by fear. 3 men, suits. One of them had a badge. "What did you tell them?" The clerk's good eye found Reese's face and stayed there, and what Reese saw in it was the specific shame of a man who'd given up everything he knew in exchange for not being hit again. Everything. The man with the cut, the kids, the truck. The clerk swallowed. "I told them which direction the truck went." "North?" "North." Reese cut the zip ties, set a $100 bill on the desk, and walked out without another word. In the parking lot, he dialed Grim. "They got the direction, north," the clerk talked. Grim was silent for 3 seconds. Reese could hear wind on the other end, so cold, open, the sound of a man standing outside. "How long ago did they leave the motel?" "Based on the swelling, 15, 20 minutes. They'll hit Route 9 and fan out. Every road north of Granger goes through a 4-mile corridor before it opens up. If they set up checkpoints—" "They won't use checkpoints," Reese said. "Checkpoints draw attention. Hale's smarter than that. He'll use mobile surveillance. 2 vehicles on the main arteries, 1 floating. They'll be looking for the truck." "Vince ditched the truck." "Where?" "I don't know. He's dark. I told him to stay dark." Reese walked to his bike, threw a leg over, and sat there with the engine off, scanning the lot. A delivery van idled near the road. A sedan with tinted windows sat in the far corner, empty, engine cold. Nothing moving, nothing wrong. But nothing felt right either. The air had that weight to it, the pressure differential that Reese recognized from deployments, the atmospheric shift that happens when the environment itself knows something bad is coming. "Grim, we need to talk about Miles." Silence. "Not on the phone," Reese added. "Come to me. I'll send coordinates." "Not yet. There's something I need to check first." Reese ended the call and sat on his bike in the cold parking lot of a motel where a minimum wage clerk had just been beaten for information that was now racing north in the hands of men who killed for a living. He pulled the quarter from his pocket, rolled it across his knuckles. 1 pass. 2. 3. Then he pocketed it and rode east. The rain started at noon. Not hard at first, a cold, fine mist that settled on leather and chrome like condensation on a glass. But by 12:30 it had thickened into a steady gray assault that turned the roads dark and the sky into a ceiling you could almost touch. Grim stood on his mother's porch and watched it fall, his arms crossed, his jaw set in the rigid line that Vince had once told him made him look like a man deciding whether to shoot someone. He wasn't deciding that. Not yet. He was waiting for Reese, and he was thinking about Miles, and he was trying to separate the logic from the fear because the two had started to bleed together in ways that made his thinking dangerous. The facts were simple. Someone had known about the cabin before they used it. That information could have come from a database search, a surveillance operation, or a human source. The first 2 were possible, but required time and resources that suggested a longer-term intelligence effort. The third was immediate, personal, close. Miles had been the one to identify Meridian Futures. Miles had been the one with contacts in digital forensics. Miles had been the one who'd immediately understood the scope of the evidence, who'd known about Victor Hale's background, who'd laid out the operational timeline with a precision that felt less like analysis and more like familiarity. Grim hated himself for thinking it. He physically felt the betrayal of the thought, a sensation in his stomach like a blade turning slowly. Miles was his brother. Miles had ridden beside him for 6 years. Miles had sat with him through the worst night of his life, the anniversary of his mother's death, 3 years ago, when Grim had parked his bike on a bridge at 2 a.m. and sat on the railing looking down at black water. And Miles had appeared without being called, without being told, had simply known, and had sat on that railing beside him without saying a word until the sun came up and the water turned from black to gray to something that almost looked like it wanted to be blue. You don't suspect a man who sat with you on a bridge, but you also don't ignore the math. Reese pulled up at 1:15, his bike throwing gravel as he cut the engine. His jacket was soaked through. Rain dripped from the brim of the cap he wore under his helmet, and his face had the tight, drawn look of someone carrying information he didn't want to deliver. He dismounted and walked to the porch, stood at the bottom of the steps. Didn't come up. "Tell me," Grimm said. Reese reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. Not his. A burner. Cheap, prepaid, the kind you buy at a gas station and throw away when you're done. Its screen was cracked. The case was black plastic, scratched and worn. "I found this in the storage unit behind the clubhouse. Back wall. Behind the tool chest where we keep the winter gear." "Whose is it?" Reese looked at him. Rain ran down his face and he didn't blink. "It was plugged in, charging, inside a boot. Miles's boot. The one he keeps in his locker for wet rides." Grimm didn't move. The rain fell. The porch swing creaked on its rusted chain. "Could be a backup phone, could be nothing." "It's not nothing." Reese held the phone out. "I turned it on. One contact, no name, just an initial. H." The letter sat in the air between them like a bullet suspended in flight. "H." "How many calls?" Grimm's voice was hollow, scraped out. The sound of a man whose chest cavity had just been emptied. 14. Over the past 3 weeks. The longest was 22 minutes. 2 days ago. 2 days ago, before the gas station. Before any of this. Grimm took the phone. His hand was steady. It was always steady. That was the cruelest part. The body performing its function while the soul inside it was coming apart like a structure fire, floor by floor, everything collapsing inward. He scrolled through the call log. 14 calls. No texts. Each one lasting between 3 and 22 minutes. The timestamps formed a pattern. Late night, early morning, the hours when a man is alone and the things he does in the dark belong only to him. "This doesn't prove anything," Grimm said. "I know. It's circumstantial." "I know. Miles has saved my life, literally, more than once." "I know that too." Reese climbed the first step. "But those boot prints at the cabin weren't circumstantial. Hale's people were in position before we moved the kids, and Miles was the only person outside this porch who knew the cabin existed. Vince knew. Vince was with the children. The cabin is in Vince's ex-wife's mother's name. Someone could have... Grimm." Reese's voice was quiet. Not angry, not accusatory, sad. The particular sadness of a man who has learned to recognize patterns and hates himself for seeing one now. "I don't want this to be true. I rode with Miles for 4 years. He pulled me out of a bar when I was 3 days into a spiral that was going to end with a pistol and a note. I owe him my life." His jaw tightened. "But I also owe these kids the truth. And the truth is that someone in our circle has been talking to the man who beat a 17-year-old girl, and this phone was hidden in Miles's boot." Inside the house, Grimm heard Noah's voice, faint, asking Lena something about the stove. The ordinary sound of a child trying to heat soup in a dead woman's kitchen. The sound of innocence persisting in a world that had declared war on it. Grimm looked at the burner phone, at the cracked screen, at the single contact. "H. Where's Miles right now?" "He said he was taking the drives to his forensics contact. That was 8 hours ago. He should have reported back by now." "Has he?" "No." The rain intensified. It hammered the porch roof like it was trying to get inside. Water ran off the gutters in thick streams, pooling in the yard, turning the grass to mud. "Call him," Grimm said. Reese pulled out his own phone and dialed. Speaker on, ring, 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 voicemail. He tried again, same result. "His bike has a GPS tracker," Reese said. "Standard club protocol, all our bikes do." "Pull it up." Reese opened the tracking app on his phone. The screen loaded, pinpointed, and displayed a location that made both men stop breathing. Miles's bike was parked at 1440 Industrial Parkway. Suite 300, Meridian Futures Development Corporation. The world went very still. The rain fell. The porch swing creaked. Noah said something about the soup being hot, and Lena said be careful, and the ordinary sounds of children surviving played underneath the silence, like a heartbeat beneath a flat line. "Maybe he's surveilling them," Reese said, but his voice had no conviction. It was the sound of a man testing a theory he'd already disproven. "For 8 hours? With his phone off? At their corporate office?" Reese had no answer for that. Grim sat down on the porch steps. The rain reached his boots. He didn't move them. He sat there and looked at the phone with the cracked screen and the single contact, and he felt something inside him rearrange itself. Not break, not shatter, but restructure. The way a building's load-bearing walls shift when the foundation is compromised. The structure holds, but it's not the same structure anymore. Vince needs to know, Reese said. Not yet. Grim? I said not yet. His voice was a blade wrapped in cloth. If Miles is compromised, then everything he's touched is compromised. Every piece of evidence he's handled, every conversation he's heard. He knows our communication protocols. He knows our safe houses. He knows the motel on Granger. He knows about the ledger and the drives and the photographs. He doesn't know about this house. No, he doesn't. And that's the only reason those kids are still breathing. Grim stood up and walked to the far end of the porch. He gripped the railing with both hands and leaned into the rain, letting it hit his face, his neck, his chest. Cold, hard, real. The kind of physical sensation that anchors you when everything internal has come loose. He thought about the bridge. 3 years ago, 2 a.m, the railing under his thighs and the water below, and the absolute certainty that the world had used up every reason for him to stay in it. And Miles, quiet, still, smelling like leather and engine oil, sitting beside him without a word, without a question, without a judgment, just sitting there until the sun came up and made the water look like something other than an ending. A man who does that doesn't betray you, but a man who's been leveraged can do things the man he used to be would never recognize. I need to see him, Grim said, face to face, before we do anything else. And if he's with Hale, then I'll know. How? Grim turned. His face was wet. Rain or something else. Reese couldn't tell, and didn't ask. Because I've looked into Miles' eyes 1,000 times. I'll know if the man looking back isn't him anymore. He went inside to tell Vince, found him in the kitchen, sitting at the small table where Grim's mother used to drink her morning coffee. The mug in front of Vince was from the cabinet, white ceramic, chipped at the rim, with a faded pattern of wildflowers that Grim's mother had chosen 30 years ago because they reminded her of the field behind her childhood home. Grim told him everything. The burner phone, the call log, the GPS location. He laid the facts out the way Miles would have, clean, sequential, without editorializing, because he owed Vince the same precision he'd want if the positions were reversed. Vince listened. His face went through 3 changes. First, denial. The flicker across his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the instinctive rejection. Then processing. The slow release of his shoulders, the way his hands opened flat on the table. The combat medic's trained response to absorb new information before reacting to it. Then something Grim had never seen on Vince's face before. Not anger, not sadness. A quiet devastation, like watching a building you built with your own hands start to tilt. Maybe there's an explanation, Vince said. Maybe. People don't just become traitors, Grim. Something happens to them first. I know. Vince looked at the mug, at the wildflowers, at the chip in the rim. If he's been talking to Hale, it's because Hale found something to use against him. Something bad enough that Miles decided protecting whatever it is was worth more than protecting us. Vince's voice was barely above a whisper. Miles doesn't break. You know that. Whatever Hale has, it's the worst thing in Miles's life. I need to find out what it is. And then what? Then I decide if my brother is still my brother, or if he's already gone. The kitchen went quiet. From the living room, the sound of Noah turning pages, Lena coughing, dry, shallow, the cough of a fever that wasn't going away. Vince stood. Go. I'll stay with the kids. Take Reese. You sure? Vince picked up the mug, rinsed it in the sink, and set it upside down on the drain board with the care of a man handling something that belonged to the dead. I'm sure of nothing, he said. But these kids need someone in this room who knows what to do if their stitch is open, and right now, that's me. Grim rode south in the rain. Reese flanked him, 2 bike lengths behind, running dark. No headlight, no running lights, just the engine and the road and the gray curtain of water falling between them and everything they'd believed was true until 40 minutes ago. They found Miles' bike where the GPS said it would be. parked in the underground garage beneath the Meridian Futures building. Level B2. Alone. No other vehicles on the level. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting everything in the pale green light of a hospital corridor or a bad dream. Grim killed his engine and listened. Water dripped from the garage ceiling. A ventilation fan turned somewhere deep in the building's mechanical core. Nothing else. The silence of a Sunday garage in a corporate building that was supposed to be empty. Miles's bike was cold. Engine off for at least 2 hours. The saddlebags were closed, locked, no sign of damage, no sign of struggle. The bike had been parked neatly, deliberately, by a man who intended to come back for it. Reese checked the stairwell. Clear. The door to the lobby was locked with a keycard system, but the stairwell continued upward. Fire escape access probably unlocked from inside. They climbed. 3rd floor. Suite 300. The door was ajar. Grim pushed it open with his boot. The office was empty. Desks, chairs, computer monitors, all dark, all still, the after-hours shell of a corporate workspace. The air smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee and the particular absence of life that offices carry when the people who fill them have gone home. But someone was here. The light in the conference room at the far end of the floor was on. Grim could see it through the glass partition, warm, yellow, the only living light on the entire floor. He walked toward it. Reese followed, staying 3 steps behind, covering the angles. They moved through the cubicle maze like they'd moved through structures in another life. Shoulders squared, weight on the balls of their feet, every doorway checked before it was crossed. The conference room door was open. Miles sat at the head of the table. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His wire-frame glasses sat on the table in front of him, and without them his face looked naked, exposed, younger, stripped of the armor that the glasses somehow provided. His eyes were red. His hands were folded in front of him, knuckles white, the posture of a man holding himself together through pure muscular force. On the table in front of him, a laptop, open, displaying what appeared to be financial documents, a glass of water, untouched, and a photograph. Grim stopped in the doorway. Reese took a position at the window watching the parking lot below. Miles looked up. He saw Grim. He saw the look on Grim's face, and something in his expression collapsed. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who didn't know him, but Grim saw it. The microfracture. The moment when a man who has been carrying a lie realizes the lie has been found. "How long have you known?" Miles asked. "About an hour." "The phone." "The phone." Miles nodded, slowly. The nod of a man who has been expecting a bullet and hears the gun cock. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." Miles reached for the photograph on the table. His hand trembled. The first time Grim had ever seen Miles's hands shake. He held the photograph up. It showed a girl, early 20s, dark hair, glasses similar to Miles. She was sitting on a park bench, laughing at something off camera, and the resemblance was so immediate, so obvious, that Grim understood before Miles said a word. "Her name is Claire," Miles said. "She's my daughter." The room went silent. The fluorescent light hummed. Rain streaked the conference room windows. "You don't have a daughter," Grim said. Not accusatory, confused. The voice of a man rewriting 6 years of history in real time. "I do. She's 23. She lives in Portland. She doesn't know I'm her father. She was raised by her mother's husband, and I agreed to that because I was 22 and terrified and doing classified work that made me a liability to anyone connected to me." Miles set the photograph down. His fingers lingered on it. "I've watched her from a distance her entire life. Birthday cards with no return address. A college fund she thinks came from a scholarship. A phone number she's never called because she doesn't know it exists." "Miles, Hale found her 6 months ago. He didn't contact me directly. He's too smart for that. He sent me a photograph. Claire walking to work. Claire getting coffee. Claire standing at a crosswalk." Miles's voice cracked. Not loudly, a hairline fracture in a wall that had held for 20 years. Then he sent one of Claire unlocking her apartment door, shot from inside the hallway, inside the building, close enough to touch. Grim felt the floor shift beneath him. Not physically, structurally. The architecture of everything he'd understood about this situation rebuilding itself around a new center of gravity. He didn't ask me to betray the club, Miles continued. Not at first. He asked for small things, club movements, ride schedules, safe house locations. Things that seemed harmless. Things I told myself didn't matter. His hands were shaking badly now. He put them flat on the table to stop them. But every piece of information I gave him was a brick in a wall he was building around us. And by the time I realized the wall was a trap, Claire's life was sitting inside it. The cabin, Grimm said. I told him about the cabin 3 months ago. I didn't know why he wanted it. I didn't know about the key. I didn't know about the children. Miles looked up and his eyes were wet and his face was the face of a man who has been drowning slowly in a room full of people and never once called for help. When you moved Lena and Noah there, when I realized what I'd done, I came here, to Hale's office, to beg him to leave the children alone. You came here to beg? Yes. And what did he say? Miles was quiet for a long time. The rain hit the windows. Reese stood motionless by the glass, watching the parking lot, but every muscle in his body was locked in the posture of a man listening to something that was changing the shape of his world. He said the children were collateral, Miles whispered. He said that every operation has acceptable losses, and that if I wanted Claire to remain unacceptable, I would continue to cooperate. A breath. Then he showed me something. Miles turned the laptop toward Grimm. The screen displayed a video, paused. The image was dark, grainy, security camera footage from a low angle, the kind mounted at knee height in commercial buildings. It showed a parking structure, a man on his knees, 3 figures standing over him. This is Tom Everett, Miles said, the building inspector, the night he was killed. He pressed play. The footage was silent, which somehow made it worse. 3 men beat Tom Everett with a methodical, professional efficiency that suggested they'd done it before. One of them, tall, controlled, wearing a dark jacket, directed the others with small gestures. A nod meant continue. A raised hand meant stop. He moved like a conductor, and the violence moved with him, orchestrated, precise, terrible. Then, at the 3-minute mark, a 4th figure appeared at the edge of the frame. He walked in from the right side of the screen, moving with purpose, carrying a phone in one hand and a set of keys in the other. He stopped, looked at the scene, did nothing. Stood there and watched a man being beaten, then turned and walked away. Grimm recognized the 4th man immediately, not his face, the footage was too dark for that, but his gait, his build, the way he carried his shoulders, slightly uneven, the left lower than the right, the permanent asymmetry of a man who'd absorbed shrapnel on his left side and never fully straightened. Vince. The air left Grimm's lungs like someone had cut a valve. He gripped the edge of the conference table and his vision narrowed to a tunnel, and inside that tunnel was the grainy image of a man who walked like his best friend walking away from a murder. That was taken 4 months ago, Miles said. Hale showed it to me the night he sent the first photograph of Claire. He said Vince had been doing contract work for Meridian's security division for over a year. Off books, cash payments, no paper trail. No. Grimm. No. The word came out harder the second time. Not denial, command, the voice of a man ordering reality to reorganize itself. That could be anyone. The footage is dark. You can't confirm identity from a gait analysis on a security camera. I know. That's what I told myself for 3 months. Miles closed the laptop. But then I started watching. Small things. Vince always knowing which route to take. Vince always available at the right time. Vince volunteering for the cabin before anyone asked. He paused. Vince suggesting the motel on Granger. A motel he'd used before. A motel where the clerk knew him by sight. Reese turned from the window. His face was white. Vince is with the children right now, he said. The sentence hit the room like a detonation. Every word a concussion wave, every syllable an expanding radius of destruction. Grimm's phone was in his hand before he finished processing the thought. He dialed the landline at the house. Ring, 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 no answer. He dialed again. Ring, 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 nothing. The room tilted, the fluorescent light buzzed, the rain fell. And inside Grimm's chest, the structure that had been holding, the walls, the beams, the load-bearing architecture of trust that had kept him vertical for 6 years, began to fail. He looked at Miles. At the man who had betrayed them to protect a daughter no one knew existed. At the man who had sat on a bridge with him until the sun came up. At the man who was now sitting in the enemy's conference room with red eyes and shaking hands, and a photograph of a girl who would never know that her father's love had been weaponized into a leash. "If you've lied to me about any of this," Grimm said, and his voice was something neither man had heard before. Not anger, not threat, but the sound of a man standing at the edge of the last thing he's willing to lose. "I will never forgive you, and that will be the kindest thing that happens." "I haven't lied, not about this." "Then get on your bike and ride north. Reese will give you coordinates. You're going to the house where I left those children with a man who might be—" He stopped. The word wouldn't come. His mouth formed it, and his throat rejected it like a body rejecting a transplant. "Might be what?" Reese asked. Grimm stared at the closed laptop. At the frozen image he could still see behind his eyes. A man with Vince's shoulders walking away from a murder without looking back. "Ride," he said. "Now. All of us. And when we get there, we find out the truth. All of it. Even the parts that kill us." They hit the garage at a run. 3 engines fired in the underground concrete, the sound bouncing off the walls like thunder trapped in a box. Grimm led. Reese flanked. Miles fell in behind, riding the position of a man who knew he'd lost the right to be trusted, but hadn't yet lost the ability to fight. The rain was heavier now, sheets of it, driving sideways across the road, turning the highway into a river of reflected headlights and brake lights and the long smeared glow of a world dissolving at the edges. They rode fast. Too fast for the conditions, too fast for the visibility, fast enough that each curve was a calculated gamble between arriving in time and not arriving at all. 27 minutes. That's how long the ride took. 27 minutes of cold rain and engine noise and the specific, unbearable silence of 3 men riding toward a house where 2 children were waiting with a man who might be their protector or their executioner, and the only way to know which was to walk through the door. They killed their engines at the end of the road. The house sat at the top of a small rise, white-clapboard porch swing, the faded paint of a life that had ended 6 years ago and been preserved like a specimen in a jar. The kitchen light was on. The porch light was off. No truck in the driveway. Grimm dismounted and drew the weapon he'd been carrying since the depot, a Beretta M9, the same sidearm he'd carried in the Marines, cleaned and maintained with the devotion of a man who hoped never to use it but refused to be unprepared. He didn't point it. He held it at his side, barrel down, safety off. He climbed the porch steps. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open. The living room was empty. The couch. The bookshelf. His mother's photograph on the mantel. Everything in place. Nothing disturbed. The house held its breath. "Lena," he called. Not loud, controlled. "Noah." Nothing. He moved through the living room to the kitchen. The light was on. The overhead fixture, the one with the yellowed glass shade that his mother had always meant to replace. The table was clear. The soup cans Noah had been eating from were rinsed and stacked by the sink. The landline phone hung on the wall, its receiver in the cradle. On the kitchen table, a single sheet of paper, handwritten. Vince's writing. Grimm recognized the heavy, left-leaning script of a man who'd learned to write with his non-dominant hand after his right was damaged by an IED. 4 lines. "They found us. Move the kids. Don't call. Don't follow. Trust me." Grimm read it 3 times. Each time the words meant something different. The first time they were relief. Vince had moved the kids, they were safe, the system had worked. The second time they were a question. Don't follow? Don't call? Since when did Vince give orders instead of asking? The third time they were a door slamming shut. Trust me, written by a man whose silhouette might have stood over a dying body 4 months ago and done nothing. Reese appeared in the kitchen doorway. He saw the note. Read it over Grimm's shoulder. He took them. He moved them. Same thing, Grimm. It's not the same thing and you know it. Do I? Reese's voice was sharp, sharper than he intended. The stress was cracking through his training, leaking out at the edges. Because an hour ago, I would have taken a bullet for Vince Calder. Right now, I don't know if he's protecting those kids or delivering them. Miles stood in the doorway behind Reese. He said nothing. His face was gray, the face of a man who understood that the damage he'd done was now cascading. Each piece of information he'd given Hale connecting to the next, building a chain of consequences that had led them to this kitchen, this note, this absence. Grimm's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered. Mr. Mercer. Hale's voice, calm, steady, the voice of a conductor between movements. You've been to my office. You've found Mr. Rourke's phone. And now you're standing in a kitchen wondering whether the man you trusted with those children is still yours or mine. Grimm said nothing. I'll make this simple. Vince Calder has been in my employ for 14 months. He was recruited after a psychiatric evaluation flagged him as financially vulnerable and emotionally isolated. He was paid through a series of cash transfers that cannot be traced to Meridian. A pause. But unlike Miles, who cooperated to protect someone he loves, Vince cooperated because he was broken, and I offered him something that felt like purpose. You're lying. Am I? Ask yourself why Vince volunteered for every safe house rotation, why he always knew the cleanest route, why he was the first to suggest the motel on Granger, a motel where the clerk recognized him because he'd been there before. Not with the club, with my men. The kitchen walls closed in. The yellow light from his mother's fixture turned the room the color of old bone. Grimm's grip on the phone was so tight, the plastic creaked. Where are the children? Safe, for now. Vince delivered them to a secondary location 20 minutes ago. They're unharmed. But their continued safety depends entirely on what happens in the next 12 hours. What do you want? The same thing I've always wanted. The evidence, all copies, the original drives, the ledger, the photographs, and the USB-labeled proof. In exchange, the children are returned. Claire Rourke remains untouched, and your club is left intact. And if I refuse? Then Vince delivers the children to a facility where they will be processed as runaways. The grandmother's dialysis records will be amended to reflect a missed appointment that triggers a welfare check that triggers a custody investigation. Noah and Lena will be separated, placed in foster systems in different counties, and the evidence, which, I should mention, is now partially in my possession thanks to Miles's original handoff of the encrypted drives, will be destroyed before any federal investigator sees it. The call ended. Grimm set the phone on his mother's kitchen table. Next to the note Vince had written, next to the cans Noah had rinsed, in the house where his mother had cooked meals and read paperbacks and died in her sleep 6 years ago, without knowing that the son who carried her house key against his heart would one day stand in her kitchen and discover that the brotherhood he'd built from broken men had broken in exactly the places he'd refused to inspect. He looked at Reese. He looked at Miles. 2 men. One who'd betrayed him for love, one who hadn't betrayed him at all. And somewhere out there, in the rain, in the dark, a man he'd called brother was driving 2 children toward a fate that depended entirely on what Grimm did next. He sat down at his mother's table, and for the first time in 6 years, Elias Mercer had no idea who to trust, where to turn, or how to save the people he'd promised to protect. And the clock that Victor Hale had started was already running down. Grimm sat at his mother's kitchen table for exactly 90 seconds. That was the time he gave himself. 90 seconds to feel it. The betrayal, the confusion, the vertigo of standing on ground that used to be solid and feeling it turn to water beneath his boots. 90 seconds to be a man whose world had just collapsed. Then he stopped being that man. He became the other one. The one who'd led convoys through kill zones with a heart rate of 62, the one who'd carried a wounded corporal across 400 meters of open desert while rounds snapped past his ears like angry wasps, the one who didn't feel things until the operation was over, and sometimes not even then. Miles. Miles straightened in the doorway. His eyes were still red. His hands had stopped shaking, but barely. The drives you handed off to your forensics contact, did Hale get them? I gave him copies, not originals. The originals are in a storage locker in Fenton. Different town, different county, rented under a name I used in intelligence work. Hale doesn't know about it. You're sure? It's the one thing I kept for myself, insurance, in case he decided Claire was acceptable after all. Grimm processed this, filed it, moved on. Reese, the tracking app, can you pull Vince's phone location? Reese already had it open. His personal phone is off, but the truck, Vince didn't buy the truck. He borrowed it from the shop on Fielder Avenue. The shop owner puts GPS trackers on all his loaners. Can you access it? The owner's a friend. He gave me the login 6 months ago when I borrowed the same truck. Reese's thumbs moved across his phone screen. The app loaded. A blue dot appeared on the map, moving south on Route 17 at 43 miles per hour. South, toward the industrial district, toward the river, toward the part of town where the factories stood empty and the streets went dark after 8 o'clock, and the only lights that burned were the ones nobody wanted to explain. He's heading for the old steel mill, Reese said. The Brennan Works. It's been closed for 12 years, but Meridian bought the property in their last acquisition round. That's where Hale will be, Miles said. If he's consolidating, that's where he'd do it. The mill has underground storage, loading docks with river access, and enough square footage to stage an operation invisible from the road. Grimm stood. The chair scraped against the kitchen floor, the same floor where his mother had stood barefoot on summer mornings, where Noah had heated soup 2 hours ago, where everything that mattered was either already lost or about to be. How much of the original evidence is still at the Creston Depot? The originals are still in locker 218, Reese said. We photographed and copied everything but put it all back. If Hale's planning to destroy evidence before the demolition, the depot is target 1. And the mill is target 2. He'll consolidate everything in one location before he burns it. Grimm looked at Miles. The drives in your storage locker in Fenton, are they complete? Everything. The video files, the financial ledger, the surveillance photographs, complete duplicates. Then those drives are the only thing that matters. If Hale destroys the originals at the depot and whatever he's stockpiled at the mill, the Fenton copies become the last surviving evidence. Which means we need to get them to federal authorities before Hale realizes they exist, Miles said. No. Grimm's voice was flat, hard, the voice of a man who'd just rewritten the entire operational plan in his head and didn't like any of it. We need to get the children first. Evidence is worthless if Noah and Lena are dead. If we go after the kids and Hale destroys the evidence, then we get the kids and lose the case. That's a trade I'll make. Every time. Grimm pulled his jacket on. The leather was still wet from the ride. It smelled like rain and exhaust and the cold mineral scent of a night that wasn't done yet. But we're not going to lose the case, because we're going to do both. He laid it out in 60 seconds. No diagrams, no whiteboard, just a man standing in a dead woman's kitchen, speaking in the clipped, precise language of a combat briefing while rain hammered the windows and the clock on the wall. His mother's clock, the one with the brass pendulum that she'd wound every Sunday, ticked toward midnight. Miles would ride to Fenton, retrieve the duplicate drives, deliver them to the FBI field office in Carver County, 50 miles east, outside the local corruption radius, staffed by agents who had no connection to Meridian's payroll. He would surrender himself as a cooperating witness. He would tell them everything. The phone, the calls, Hale's leverage, Claire, all of it. The confession would validate the evidence and give the feds probable cause to move immediately. Reese would ride to the Creston Depot. If the originals were still in locker 218, he would retrieve them and transport them to a secondary location. If Hale's people had already arrived, he would document the destruction, photographs, video, timestamps, creating a chain of evidence that proved intentional spoliation. Grimm would go to the mill, alone. No, Reese said, it's not a discussion. You're riding into a facility controlled by a private military operator with unknown numbers of armed personnel to extract 2 children who may or may not be there based on a GPS signal from a borrowed truck. Reese's voice was tight. That's not a plan. That's a funeral. Vince is with the children. Vince may be working for Hale. Vince may be. Or Vince may be doing exactly what his note said, moving the kids because someone found the house. We don't know which. Grimm met Reese's eyes. But I know this. If I show up at that mill with 3 bikes and a tactical approach, Hale's people will see us coming and the children become hostages. If I show up alone, I'm a negotiation. 1 man, 1 key, 1 conversation. And if the conversation goes wrong, then you'll be at the depot and Miles will be at the FBI office, and the evidence survives even if I don't. The kitchen went quiet. The clock ticked. The rain fell. and two men looked at a third who just calmly described his own expendability as an acceptable operational outcome. "Grim," Miles said. His voice cracked on the name. "Let me come with you. I owe you that. You owe me the drives. You owe me the FBI. You owe me the truth told to people who can act on it." Grim's hand went to the chain around his neck, the one that had held his mother's house key, now removed, now sitting on the counter where Lena had been standing when she'd agreed to testify. The chain was empty. He left it that way. "That's how you pay this debt, Miles. Not by dying next to me, by making sure what we found doesn't die with us." They separated in the driveway. 3 engines, 3 directions. The rain made the road look like molten glass, reflecting the taillights as they split apart, Miles east, Reese north, Grim south, toward the river, toward the steel mill, toward whatever waited in a building full of darkness and men who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill. The Brennan Works appeared out of the rain like a shipwreck rising from deep water. Massive, black against the blacker sky. The mill's main structure was a cathedral of rusted iron and shattered glass, its smokestacks reaching upward into clouds that pressed down against the earth like a lid being slowly closed. The property was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, but the gate on the south side hung open. Not broken, not forced, just open, the way a mouth hangs open when it's waiting for something to walk in. Grim killed his engine 200 yards from the gate and pushed the bike into a stand of dead brush along the access road. The rain covered his approach, every footstep absorbed by the downpour, every breath lost in the white noise of water hitting metal and concrete and all the surfaces of a building that had been dying for 12 years. The truck was there, parked inside the gate, near the loading dock. Engine off, doors closed, empty. Grim moved along the fence line until he found a gap, a section of chain link that had been cut and peeled back recently, the edges still bright where the cutter had bitten through. He slipped through and crossed 30 yards of open ground to the loading dock, his boots silent on wet concrete, the Beretta in his right hand, his left trailing the wall. The dock door was open 4 feet. He dropped to his knees and looked under it. Inside, the mill floor stretched away into darkness, a vast open space supported by iron columns the size of tree trunks. The ceiling lost somewhere above, in a maze of catwalks and crane rails and the skeletal remains of an overhead conveyor system that hadn't moved in over a decade. But the far end of the mill was lit. Work lights on portable stands, the kind used by construction crews and film sets, throwing harsh white pools across a section of floor that had been cleared and organized with military precision. Tables, equipment cases, and in the center, a stack of document boxes. Dozens of them, arranged around 2 industrial-grade shredders and a 50-gallon burn barrel that was already smoking. They were destroying evidence. Right now. Tonight. Grim counted bodies. 4 men in the lit area, moving with the efficient, unhurried pace of people performing a task they'd done before. 2 more near the far wall, stationed at points that gave them sight lines across the entire floor. Armed. Rifles slung low, muzzles down, the casual readiness of trained operators who expected no interruption. 6 men, at minimum. There could be more in the offices above, in the basement levels, in the sections of the mill that the work lights didn't reach. He moved inside, staying low, staying close to the column line, using the shadows the way he'd used them in buildings on the other side of the world, not as cover, but as camouflage, becoming part of the darkness rather than hiding from it. The mill smelled like rust and old oil and the metallic tang of heated metal. The burn barrel was hot, eating paper, turning evidence to ash while the rain drummed on the roof like a countdown. He was 40 yards from the lit area when he heard the voice. Vince, not shouting, not whispering, speaking at the volume of a man who was being careful with his words, because each one was being weighed by someone who had the power to end the conversation permanently. The deal was the kids stay out of it. The deal changed when your road captain decided to be a hero. Hale's voice, controlled, measured. The voice from the phone call, but different in person. Richer, colder, carrying the specific gravity of a man who was accustomed to being in the room where decisions were made about who lived and who didn't. Grim shifted position, found an angle through the column line that gave him a partial view of the lit area. Vince stood near the tables, his back to a column, his posture rigid. Not restrained, he wasn't tied, wasn't cuffed, was standing freely, but his body language carried the tension of a man surrounded by armed men who could change his status from free to dead with a single gesture. And next to him, sitting on a metal folding chair with his knees pulled to his chest, was Noah. The boy's face was pale, his eyes were wide, but he wasn't crying. He sat with the terrible stillness of a child who'd learned that stillness was safer than movement. Lena stood behind the chair, one hand on Noah's shoulder. Her injured arm was pressed against her side. Her face was drawn tight, the color drained from it by pain and fear, and the harsh white light that made everyone in the room look like they'd already died. Hale stood across from them, tall, lean, clean-shaven, wearing a dark jacket over a dark shirt, no tie, the wardrobe of a man who dressed for function. His face was angular, sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same iron that built the mill. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who had spent his life in rooms where violence was discussed with the same detachment that other people used to discuss quarterly reports. "Where's Mercer?" Hale asked Vince. "I don't know." "Don't lie to me, Calder. You've been reliable for 14 months. Don't ruin it now." "I moved the kids because someone compromised the safe house. I brought them here because this is the only location you told me was secure. That's what you paid me to do. That's what I did." Vince's voice was steady, but underneath it, buried deep, almost invisible, Grim heard something, a frequency, a vibration. The sound a man makes when he's performing a role, and the performance is the only thing keeping everyone in the room alive. "Mercer doesn't know I'm here." "Nobody does." Hale studied him, the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, looking not at what's there, but at what's hiding behind it. "The evidence from Locker 218. Mercer has copies." "He did. The copies were at the house you found. You sent a team. The team recovered them." This was a lie. Grim knew it. The copies were with Miles, heading east, heading toward Fenton and the storage locker and the FBI field office, and the only remaining lifeline for every person standing in this building. Vince was lying, and the lie told Grim everything the note and the GPS signal and the video footage hadn't. Vince wasn't delivering the children. Vince was trying to buy time. The realization hit Grim with the force of a concussion wave. Not relief, not absolution, but the staggering weight of understanding that a man he'd been prepared to condemn was standing in a room full of armed men, feeding them false intelligence, keeping two children alive through nothing but the strength of a lie and the hope that someone would come. Hale wasn't convinced. Grim could see it in the way he stood, the slight tilt of his head, the measured pause before his next words, the body language of a man who had heard thousands of lies and developed an immune response to all of them. If Mercer's copies were at the house, then we have everything. The originals at the depot have been retrieved. The drives Miles' work delivered are accounted for. And in approximately, Hale checked his watch, a simple gesture that carried enormous menace. 40 minutes, this facility will be clean. Every document shredded, every drive degaussed, every recording erased. Then let the kids go. When the operation is complete. Now. Hale looked at Vince the way a man looks at a tool that has just tried to negotiate its own purpose. No. Grim had heard enough. He mapped the room in his mind. 6 men, 2 by the far wall, 4 working the evidence. Hale in the center, Vince near the column, the children between them. Distance from his position to Noah, 60 yards. Open ground for the last 30. No cover, no concealment. Just iron columns and shadows, and the gamble that surprise was worth more than numbers. He moved, not toward the light, laterally. Along the column line to the west wall, then up, a maintenance ladder bolted to the iron framework, leading to the catwalk system that ran the length of the mill at a height of 30 feet. The rungs were wet, cold, rusted in places. He climbed with his weight on the outsides of his boots, minimizing contact, minimizing sound. The Beretta went into his waistband. He needed both hands. The catwalk groaned under him. A low, metallic protest that was swallowed by the rain on the roof. He moved in a crouch, staying below the railing, his eyes on the lit area below. From here he could see everything. The layout, the positions, the distances. and he could see something he hadn't seen from ground level. A second room. Behind the main floor, accessed through a pair of heavy steel doors that stood partially open. Inside, illuminated by a single overhead fixture, was a communication setup. Monitors, radios, a laptop connected to an antenna array that suggested satellite uplink capability. And standing at the console, speaking into a phone, was a man Grimm didn't recognize. The man was young, 30s, well-built, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the rigidity of active military. He spoke into the phone with the clipped cadence of someone delivering a situation report, and though Grimm couldn't hear the words, he could read the body language. This wasn't a hired contractor. This was an operator, connected to something bigger than Meridian's private security division. There was a command structure above Hale. Someone was listening. Someone was waiting. Grimm filed it and kept moving. The catwalk ran to a junction point directly above the lit area, where two walkways crossed. From there, a vertical access ladder dropped to the mill floor, landing behind a row of decommissioned smelting furnaces that would provide cover to within 20 yards of where the children sat. 20 yards. 6 armed men, 2 children, 1 Beretta with 15 rounds. He'd done worse math in worse places. He was at the junction when his phone vibrated. Reese, a text, depot clear, original secured, en route to secondary location. Hale's team missed locker 218. They hit the wrong section. We have everything. Grimm felt something unlock in his chest. Not relief. Ammunition. Every piece of evidence that existed was now in friendly hands. The originals with Reese, the duplicates with Miles. Hale's operation was burning paper that no longer mattered. The only things that mattered were 60 feet below him, sitting on a folding chair and standing with a hand on a boy's shoulder. He descended the access ladder, slow, silent. Each rung tested before weight was committed. His boots touched the mill floor behind the furnace line, and the smell hit him. Old metal, sulfur, the ghost of heat that had lived in these machines for decades and never fully left. He drew the Beretta, checked the chamber. Round seated, safety off, 20 yards. He moved along the furnace line to the last unit, crouched behind its bulk, and assessed. The 2 guards by the far wall were facing inward, toward the evidence area. Their sightlines covered the main floor, but not the furnace line. The angle was wrong, blocked by the evidence tables and the shredders. The 4 workers were focused on their task, feeding documents into machines with the mechanical rhythm of men on a deadline. Hale stood with his back to Grimm, partially, a 40-degree angle that exposed his left shoulder and the side of his face. Vince was facing Grimm's direction, but his eyes were on Hale. He hadn't seen movement in the shadows behind the furnaces. Grimm needed Vince to know he was here, without speaking, without signaling, without alerting anyone else in the room. He picked up a small piece of rust, a flake of iron oxide the size of a coin, and flicked it. It skittered across the concrete floor and stopped 3 feet from Vince's right boot. Vince didn't look down, but his body changed. A micro-adjustment. The shift of weight from his left foot to his right. The combat stance of a man who's just received information and is preparing to act on it. It was invisible to everyone in the room except Grimm, because it was their signal. Developed not in training but in the field. In a hallway, in a building in a city whose name was classified, when they'd been pinned by fire, and the only communication they had was the language of weight shifts and breath patterns, and the silent vocabulary of men who'd learned to speak without sound. Vince knew. Now Grimm needed a diversion, something to pull the guards' attention west. Away from the children, away from Vince, away from the 20 yards of open floor that Grimm would need to cross. His phone. He set it to the loudest ringtone, maximum volume, and slid it across the floor toward the west wall. It traveled 15 feet and stopped against the base of a column, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. Then he called it from the burner phone he'd taken from Miles's boot. The ringtone exploded into the silence like a grenade. Loud, sharp, obscenely cheerful. The default tone, the one he'd never bothered to change, echoing off the iron walls of the mill with the clarity of a gunshot. Every head turned. Both guards swung their rifles west. The workers stopped. Hale pivoted, his hand going to the weapon under his jacket. Vince moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He turned, grabbed Noah off the folding chair with one arm, pulled Lena with the other, and drove them both toward the furnace line, with the controlled violence of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment and had rehearsed it in his mind 100 times in the past hour. Grim stepped out from behind the furnace and fired twice. Not at people. At the work lights. The first shot hit the nearest stand and the bulb exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. The second hit the portable generator powering the light array, and the entire lit area died, plunged into a darkness so sudden and total that it felt like the building itself had closed its eyes. Muzzle flashes erupted from the far wall, the guards firing blind, their rounds hitting iron and concrete, and the decommissioned furnaces with a sound like the world being taken apart with hammers. Grim was already moving, low, fast, toward the furnace line where Vince was pushing the children into the gap between two massive units. "Down!" Grim shouted. "Stay down!" Noah hit the ground. Lena covered him. Vince crouched beside them, his body forming a wall between the children and the gunfire, his arms spread wide like a man trying to hold back a flood with nothing but his chest. "Grim." Vince's voice in the dark, ragged. "I'm sorry. Later." "No, now, in case there isn't a later." Vince's breathing was harsh, fast. "I took the money, 14 months. I was broke and broken, and Hale offered me work that felt like it mattered, and I didn't ask what it was because I didn't want to know. By the time I understood what Meridian was doing, I was already inside it. And by then, he had enough on me to... Vince. I never hurt anyone. I gave them routes and schedules, and I hated myself for every one, but I never... Vince." Grim's hand found his shoulder in the dark. Gripped it, not gently. The grip of a man holding a rope that someone's life depends on. "I know." 2 words. They weren't absolution. They weren't forgiveness. They were the acknowledgement that in the space between what a man does and what a man is, there exists a gap wide enough for understanding, and that gap was the only ground they had to stand on right now. Gunfire intensified. Rounds punched through the furnace housing above their heads, showering them with rust and metal shavings. The guards were advancing, using the sound of the phone to triangulate, moving in pairs the way trained operators move, one covering, one closing. "We need to get out," Vince said. "The loading dock, south wall, 60 yards. 60 yards in the dark with 2 kids and 6 shooters. 5. Grim ejected his magazine, counted rounds by feel, 11 remaining. "I hit the generator operator when the lights went out. He went down." "You sure?" "I heard him fall." Vince grabbed Noah. Grim grabbed Lena. They moved along the furnace line in a crouch, heading south, the darkness both shield and prison. Behind them, voices, Hale's, sharp and controlled, issuing commands in the clipped vocabulary of tactical operations. Flashlight beams cut through the dark, sweeping the mill floor in erratic arcs. They reached the end of the furnace line, open ground between them and the loading dock. 30 yards of clear floor with no cover except a row of steel support columns spaced 15 feet apart. Beyond the dock, the rain, the fence, the road, the bikes. "On my go," Grim said. "Run straight. Don't look back. Don't stop." "Grim," Lena's voice, trembling but present, the voice of a girl who'd run before and was prepared to run again. "Stay behind Vince. Hold Noah's hand. Don't let go." Grim stepped out from the furnace line and fired 3 rounds toward the flashlight beams. Not aimed to kill, aimed to suppress, to buy seconds, to create the momentary hesitation that combat training teaches you to exploit. The beams scattered. Voices shouted. Return fire cracked across the mill floor, hitting the columns, hitting the wall, hitting everything except the 4 figures running through the dark toward the loading dock. Vince ran with Noah under his arm like a football, the boy's feet barely touching the ground. Lena ran beside them, her injured arm pressed against her chest, her legs pumping with the desperate efficiency of someone running on adrenaline and fear and the last reserves of a body that had been pushed beyond every limit it had. Grim covered the retreat, walking backward, firing at muzzle flashes, 1 round, 2. Each shot bought a second. Each second bought a yard. The math was brutal and precise, and the only kind of math that mattered. They reached the dock. Vince hauled Noah through the gap in the loading door. Lena followed. Grim fired his last 3 rounds and dove through the opening, hitting the wet concrete outside and rolling to his feet in the rain. The bike's 200 yards south, past the fence, in the brush. 1 bike, 4 people. Vince, the truck. Won't start. Hale's people disabled it. Grim looked at the fence, at the rain, at the 2 children standing in the dark with bare faces turned up toward a sky that offered nothing but cold water and indifference. Then he heard it. A sound that cut through the rain and the gunfire and the chaos inside the mill like a blade through silk. Engines. Not 1, not 2, 7, 8. The deep rolling thunder of Harley-Davidson Vi-twins approaching from the east, and as they crested the access road, their headlights swept across the mill property like searchlights, and Grim saw the patches, iron veil, every one of them. And at the front of the formation, riding point with the intensity of a man who'd been woken by a phone call and had spent the past hour calling every brother he knew, was a figure Grim recognized even through the rain. Reese. He hadn't gone to the secondary location. He'd gone to the clubhouse. He'd broken the blackout. He'd told them everything. The key, the children, the mill, the betrayal, the evidence, all of it. And they'd come. Not because it was smart. Not because the odds were good. Because somewhere in the broken machinery of their damaged, imperfect lives, a signal had fired that said children are in danger. And the response to that signal was the only thing that none of them, not one, had ever questioned. The bikes surrounded the loading dock. 8 riders, dismounting in the rain, forming a perimeter with the silent coordination of men who'd ridden together long enough that movement was language and language was unnecessary. Reese walked to Grim. His face was wet. His eyes were hard. He held out a phone. Not his, not a burner, but an encrypted device with a federal seal on the back. Miles made it to the FBI field office 40 minutes ago. He's in custody, cooperating. The drives are in evidence. Reese paused. He asked them to give me this. It's a direct line to the case agent. She's been building a file on Meridian for 2 years. She just didn't have enough. She does now. She does now. And she's mobilizing a tactical team. ETA, 35 minutes. Grim looked at the phone, at the federal seal, at the lifeline that had arrived wrapped in the confession of a man who'd betrayed them all to protect a daughter none of them knew existed. 35 minutes, Grim repeated. Hale knows we're here. He's got men, and he's got weapons, and he's got 35 minutes to destroy whatever's left inside that building and disappear. Grim looked at the mill, at the dark shape of it against the darker sky, at the loading dock where muzzle flashes still flickered like dying stars. Inside that building, a man named Victor Hale was standing in a cathedral of rusted iron, surrounded by the burning remnants of a 15-year criminal empire. And the only thing between him and escape was a chain-link fence, a rainy night, and a group of broken men on motorcycles who had decided that tonight was the night they stopped letting the world destroy the things they loved. He turned to Vince. The big man stood in the rain, Noah still in his arms, the boy's face buried against his chest. Vince's eyes met Grim's, and what passed between them was not forgiveness. That would take time, conversations, the slow and painful archaeology of trust being rebuilt from rubble, but recognition. The acknowledgement that a man can fail and still fight, that a debt can exist and a battle can still be shared, that the distance between betrayal and redemption is measured not in words but in what you do when the people who need you are standing in the rain with nowhere left to go. Take the kids, Grim said. Get them behind the perimeter. Don't let them out of your sight. Where are you going? Grim looked at the mill, at the smoke rising from the burn barrel inside, at the evidence that was still being destroyed, still being erased, still being fed into machines designed to make the truth disappear. Hale has the original murder weapon inside that building, the weapon used on Tom Everett. If it burns, the video footage is circumstantial. A defense attorney will argue fabrication. If I get the weapon, it's physical evidence, DNA, forensics, the kind of thing that doesn't need a witness to speak because the blood speaks for itself. You can't go back in there alone. I won't be alone. Grim looked at the 8 riders standing in the rain, men with scars and nightmares and histories that would make most people weep, men who'd come because they were called and would stay because they chose to. Reese, how many of them are willing? Reese didn't even turn to ask. All of them. The rain fell harder. Inside the mill, something crashed, metal on metal, the sound of structures failing, of barricades being built or barriers being destroyed. Hale was preparing, fortifying or evacuating, and the difference between the two would determine whether the next 35 minutes ended with an arrest or a disappearance. Grimm chambered a fresh round. The sound was small and final, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been building for days. Then let's finish this. 8 engines roared to life behind him. The sound filled the industrial wasteland, raw, enormous, the sound of something unstoppable moving toward something immovable. Headlights cut through the rain. Boots hit concrete. And Elias Mercer walked toward the loading dock of the Brennan Works steel mill with a loaded weapon in his hand and the last remaining members of his shattered brotherhood at his back, moving toward a confrontation that would end either with the truth surviving or with every person who'd carried it buried beneath the same iron and rust that had hidden it for 15 years. And behind them, standing in the rain with a blanket around his shoulders and the cleaned brass key still hanging from a cord around his neck, Noah Briggs watched them go, and he did not look away. They hit the loading dock like a wave breaking against iron. Grimm went through first, low, fast, the Beretta up, his flashlight mounted on the rail cutting a white line through the dark. Behind him, Reese. Behind Reese, 6 riders from the Iron Veil whose names didn't matter right now because what mattered was that they were here, moving through the gap in the loading door with the coordinated silence of men who understood that the next 10 minutes would define everything they'd ever claimed to be. The mill floor was chaos. The burn barrel had tipped. Someone had knocked it during the blackout, and burning paper had scattered across the concrete, small fires blooming in orange clusters that threw shifting, unstable light across the iron columns and the catwalk above. Smoke climbed toward the ceiling and hung there, thick and acrid, turning the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe it. Hale's men had repositioned. 2 at the communications room, 2 behind the evidence tables, 1 on the catwalk. The 6th, the one Grimm had hit during the initial diversion, was down near the generator, not moving, 5 active, against 9. The numbers favored Grimm's side, but numbers were only part of the equation. Hale's men were trained, armed with rifles, and operating in a structure they knew. The Iron Veil riders carried sidearms and the kind of reckless conviction that either wins wars or fills cemeteries, and the difference between the two usually came down to the first 30 seconds. The first 30 seconds went like this. Reese moved right, drawing fire from the catwalk shooter. The rounds hit the column beside his head and threw sparks across his face, and he didn't flinch, didn't blink, just dropped to one knee and returned 2 shots that hit the catwalk railing and sent the shooter scrambling for cover behind the crane rail. 2 Iron Veil riders flanked left, engaging the men at the evidence tables. Gunfire echoed through the mill like the building itself was screaming, each shot multiplied by the iron walls until the sound became a physical thing, a pressure wave you felt in your teeth, in your sternum, and the back of your skull. Grimm didn't engage. He moved through the chaos the way water moves through a broken dam, finding the gaps, the seams, the spaces between the violence where a single man could pass unnoticed. He kept his eyes on the communications room, on the steel doors, on the room where the monitors and radios and satellite uplink sat, because that room was the nerve center of Hale's operation, and somewhere inside it, or near it, was the evidence he needed. The murder weapon. The physical proof that connected Meridian to Tom Everett's death. He reached the steel doors. One was open 6 inches. He pressed against the wall and listened. Inside, a voice, the young operator he'd seen earlier, speaking rapidly into a phone, his tone shifting from professional to urgent to something that sounded like the first note of panic. Grimm went through the door. The operator turned. His hand went to the weapon on his hip. Grimm crossed the distance in 2 strides and hit him. Not with the gun, with his left hand, an open palm strike to the solar plexus that drove the air out of the man's lungs and dropped him to his knees. The operator's weapon clattered to the floor. Grimm kicked it under the console. "Where's the weapon?" Grimm said. "The one used on Tom Everett." The operator looked up at him, young, maybe 30, brown eyes wide with the particular fear of a man who has just realized that the operation he signed up for has exceeded the boundaries of anything he was trained to handle. "Vault," the man gasped. "Basement level, room 6. "Where's Hale?" "Gone." the operator coughed. Stairwell, roof access. He has a vehicle staged on the north side. Grimm zip-tied the operator's wrist to the console leg with a cable tie from his jacket pocket, a habit from another life, the kind of thing you carry because the day you don't is the day you need it. He took the operator's radio, keyed it. Reese. Static, then go. Hale's running. Roof access, north side of the building. He has transport staged. Copy. I'm on it. Take 2 with you. Don't let him leave. He won't. Grimm descended. The basement stairs were narrow, concrete, lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in a red-orange glow that made the walls look like they were bleeding. The smell changed as he went down, colder, wetter, the mineral tang of standing water and old concrete, and something underneath it that smelled like rust but wasn't rust. It was older than rust, darker. Room 6 was at the end of a corridor lined with heavy steel doors, each one numbered, each one locked. Room 6's door was unlocked, recently. The bolt was drawn back, the handle wiped clean. Someone had been here tonight, had accessed what was inside, had considered destroying it and decided there wasn't time. Grimm opened the door. The room was small, 10 feet by 12. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a single overhead bulb that buzzed when he found the switch. Against the far wall, a metal shelf holding 3 plastic evidence bags, the kind used by law enforcement, sealed, labeled, dated. Inside the first bag, a crowbar, 24 inches, steel. And along the striking end, dark stains that had soaked into the metal's pores the way certain truths soak into certain lives, permanently, indelibly, beyond cleaning. The label on the bag read CE7/site, Creston Avenue Depot/date, February 14th. Tom Everett. The building inspector who'd kept paper records because he believed documentation was protection, who'd stored his evidence in locker 218 because he thought the truth would save him, who'd been beaten with this crowbar on a loading dock in February while a 17-year-old girl watched from behind a support column, and a man who looked like Vince Calder walked away without turning around. Grimm picked up the bag, held it, felt the weight of it, physical and otherwise. Then he took the other 2 bags as well, because evidence doesn't negotiate and completeness doesn't compromise. He climbed the stairs. The gunfire above had changed, sporadic now, not sustained. The fight was ending, not with a dramatic finale, but with the gradual collapse of resistance that happens when trained men realize they're outmanned and the mission they were protecting has already failed. When Grimm emerged onto the mill floor, the fires had been stamped out. 4 of Hale's men were on the ground, 2 restrained, 2 unconscious, none dead. The catwalk shooter had climbed down and surrendered after a rider named Jennings, a former MP with arms like bridge cables, and the quiet demeanor of a man who could end a fight without raising his voice, had simply walked toward him through the gunfire with his hands visible and his voice steady, saying, "Son, you're done," with such absolute certainty that the shooter had believed him. The evidence tables were intact. The shredders had been stopped midway through their work. Half the documents were destroyed. Half survived. The burn barrel's spilled contents smoldered on the concrete, curling at the edges but still legible. Financial records, property documents, the paper architecture of a criminal empire caught between destruction and preservation. Grimm walked through the aftermath, past the columns scarred by gunfire, past the shredders full of dead secrets, past the men on the ground who had followed orders for money and were now lying on cold concrete wondering how the math had changed so fast. He stepped outside through the loading dock into the rain. Vince stood where he'd left him, behind the perimeter of bikes, Noah still pressed against his chest. The boy had his eyes closed, not sleeping, hiding, the way children hide when the world is too loud and the only safe place left is the warmth of another person's body. Lena stood beside them. Her face was wet. Rain and something else. She watched Grimm approach with eyes that held no hope and no despair, just the flat, exhausted awareness of a girl who had been running for weeks and couldn't tell whether this was the end or just another pause before the next beginning. Grimm held up the evidence bag. "The weapon," he said. "Tom Everett's blood. Physical evidence." Lena looked at it, at the dark stains on the crowbar, at the shape of the thing that had ended a man's life while she watched from the shadows. Her jaw trembled once. Just once. Then it stopped. "Good," she said, and the word carried the weight of every night she'd slept in doorways, every meal she'd missed, every bruise she'd absorbed, every moment she'd spent wondering if any of it would matter. Sirens. Distant at first, then building, the rising wail of federal vehicles approaching from the east, cutting through the rain with the authority of something that had been a long time coming. Red and blue lights appeared on the access road, refracting through the downpour, turning the steel mill's rusted facade into a canvas of shifting color. 23 minutes. The FBI tactical team arrived 12 minutes ahead of schedule, led by a case agent named Torres, who stepped out of the lead vehicle with the calm intensity of a woman who had spent 2 years building a case against Meridian Futures and had just been handed the missing pieces by a man in handcuffs who couldn't stop talking. Torres took control of the scene with an efficiency that made Grimm's military training look leisurely. Her team secured Hale's men, cataloged the evidence on the mill floor, and established a chain of custody for the materials Grimm brought up from the vault. She spoke into her radio in short, precise bursts that contained names, case numbers, and legal terminology that moved through the air like ammunition. Reese appeared from the north side of the building. His face was cut, a shallow laceration across his left cheekbone, already crusting, the kind of wound he wouldn't notice until someone pointed it out. Behind him, 2 Iron Veil riders escorted Victor Hale. Hale walked with his hands cuffed in front of him. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. His face was unmarked. Reese hadn't hit him, hadn't needed to. He'd been caught at his vehicle, keys in hand, 30 seconds from disappearing into the rain. The expression on his face wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was the cold, calculating neutrality of a man who was already assembling his legal defense before his feet stopped moving. He saw Grimm. Their eyes met. "You should have taken the deal, Mercer." Grimm looked at him. At the lean face, the deep-set eyes, the jaw that looked like iron. At the man who had leveraged a father's love into a weapon, who had bought a broken veteran's loyalty with cash and manufactured purpose, who had beaten a girl and hunted a boy and killed a building inspector for the crime of keeping records. "There was never a deal," Grimm said. "There was just a man with a key and a kid who was brave enough to hand it to a stranger." Hale said nothing. Torres's agents took him. He disappeared into the back of a federal vehicle, and the door closed, and the rain kept falling, and the sirens eventually stopped because there was no one left to chase. The hours that followed were procedural. Statements taken in the back of federal vehicles. Evidence logged and transported. The mill secured as a crime scene, its perimeter wrapped in yellow tape that snapped in the wind like something trying to get free. Torres interviewed Grimm for 45 minutes, then Reese, then Vince. She interviewed Lena separately, in the back of a heated SUV, with a victim's advocate present, and a blanket around the girl's shoulders, and a cup of coffee in her hands that she held, but didn't drink. Noah fell asleep in the back of a federal vehicle. A female agent covered him with her jacket. He slept with his knees pulled to his chest, and his hand wrapped around the brass key on its cord, and he didn't wake up for 3 hours. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The sky over the industrial district turned from black to gray to a color that wasn't quite blue, but was trying. The sky of a town that had been holding its breath for a long time and was just beginning to exhale. Miles cooperated fully. His confession, delivered over 6 hours in the Carver County FBI field office, provided the structural framework that connected every piece of evidence to Meridian's command structure. He named names, dates, transactions. He described the mechanics of Hale's leverage operation with the detached precision of an intelligence analyst conducting a posthumous debrief on his own life. When he finished, the case agent told him that his cooperation would be noted. Miles nodded. He didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. The charges came in waves. Garrett Pembroke, Meridian's CEO, was arrested at his home 3 days later, still in his bathrobe, still holding the coffee he'd been drinking when the agents knocked. The precinct captain Lena had identified was suspended, then indicted. The city council member whose permits had enabled the land seizures resigned on a Tuesday and was arrested on a Wednesday. Over the following weeks, 27 individuals were charged under federal racketeering statutes. The investigation expanded to include the 19 disappearances documented in the ledger, and forensic teams began the slow, careful work of searching properties along the redevelopment corridor for remains. 12 of the 19 were eventually found. Their families were notified by agents who knocked on doors and spoke quietly and didn't leave until the crying stopped or the questions ran out, whichever came last. Lena testified before a federal grand jury on a Thursday in October. She wore a borrowed blazer and her hair pulled back, and the scar on her forearm was visible when she raised her right hand, and she told the truth in a voice that started shaking and ended steady. And when she was done, the foreperson, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and a face that said she'd heard enough lies to recognize the truth when it finally showed up, nodded once. The indictments were unanimous. Months passed, the kind of months that feel like years when you're young and like days when you're not. The seasons shifted, the leaves turned. The town that had been dying slowly began the even slower process of figuring out whether it wanted to live. Noah went back to school. His grandmother, whose dialysis continued, whose apartment building was removed from the demolition list, whose ownership was legally affirmed by a court order that carried the weight of every piece of evidence Tom Everett had locked away, met him at the bus stop every afternoon. She didn't know everything. She knew enough. She held his hand on the walk home, and he let her, and neither of them talked about the things that had happened in the dark, because the daylight was doing its work, and some wounds heal better in the sun. Lena enrolled in a community college in a neighboring town. She studied criminal justice because the irony appealed to her, and because she'd learned in the space of 3 terrible weeks that systems fail and people fill the gap, and someone has to understand both to keep either from breaking. She called Grim once a month. The conversations were short, 5 minutes, sometimes less. But they were steady, and steadiness was the thing she'd been missing longest. Vince pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges related to his 14 months of cooperation with Meridian's security division. His sentence was reduced to probation and community service based on his role in protecting the children and his testimony against Hale's operational structure. He stood before the judge and said, "I was broken, and a broken man is easy to buy. That doesn't excuse it, it explains it." The judge, a veteran himself, looked at Vince for a long time, and then set the sentence at 2 years probation and 300 hours of service. Vince completed the hours in 5 months. He spent them at the VA hospital, doing the only work that had ever made sense to him. Sitting with men who were wounded, holding their hands when the shaking started, and saying nothing because sometimes nothing is exactly what a man in pain needs to hear. He and Grim didn't speak for 3 months after the mill. The silence wasn't hostile, it was structural. The load-bearing walls of their friendship had cracked, and both men understood that weight couldn't be reapplied until the repairs were finished. Vince sent a letter, handwritten, left-leaning script, no envelope, just folded paper slipped under the door of the clubhouse. It said, "I'm the reason the cabin was compromised. I'm the reason the motel was found. I'm the reason you couldn't trust your own people. I will spend the rest of my life earning back what I cost, if you'll let me." Grim read the letter in the parking lot, sitting on his bike, engine off. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it and put it in the pocket of his cut, against his chest, where the house key used to hang. The next day he rode to Vince's apartment, knocked once. When Vince opened the door, Grim handed him a thermos of coffee, the same brand they'd shared in the motel hallway on that long, impossible night, and said, "There's a charity ride next Saturday. Veterans Children Fund. You're riding point." Vince looked at the thermos, at Grim's face, at the invitation wrapped in an assignment, wrapped in the only language either of them knew how to speak. "Okay," he said. That was enough. Miles's case was more complicated. His cooperation had been essential to the prosecution, but his betrayal had nearly cost 2 children their lives. The FBI treated him as a cooperating witness rather than a defendant, but the Iron Veil's internal reckoning was slower and less forgiving than the federal justice system. Grim called a full table, all 11 members, the first since the crisis began, and Miles sat at the end and told them everything. The phone, the calls, Claire, the photographs of his daughter unlocking her apartment door, the way Hale had disassembled his loyalty one small compromise at a time until the man sitting at the table barely recognized the man who'd started answering those calls 6 months ago. The vote was 7-4. Miles was stripped of his patch for 1 year. The dissenting 4, including Grim and Reese, voted for immediate reinstatement based on the fact that his confession and the Fenton drives had been the single most important factor in bringing down Meridian's operation. But the majority spoke, and Miles accepted the decision with the quiet, unflinching grace of a man who understood that accountability was not punishment, but architecture, the necessary rebuilding of a structure that his actions had damaged. He spent the year riding alone, not exiled, present, attending events, showing up, doing the work without the patch, without the identity, without the armor of belonging. It was the hardest year of his life, harder than the classified incident that had ended his intelligence career, harder than the decades of watching his daughter grow up from a distance, harder than anything except the 3-minute video of a man being beaten to death while he stood in a conference room and did nothing to stop it, because doing something would have meant losing the only person he'd ever loved more than his own integrity. At the end of the year, Grimm handed him the patch personally, in the parking lot of the Rusted Spoke, in the rain, because important things in their lives always seem to happen in the rain. "Welcome back," Grimm said. Miles held the patch, looked at it, ran his thumb across the stitching. "I don't deserve this." "No, you earned it. There's a difference." Claire came to visit that Christmas. Miles hadn't told her, couldn't tell her, not yet, maybe not ever, about his role in the case or his connection to the men who'd exposed Meridian's crimes. But he introduced her to the club at a holiday gathering, and she shook Grimm's hand and said, "My dad doesn't talk about his friends very often, but when he does, he talks about you." And Grimm looked at Miles and saw in the man's eyes the very specific agony of a secret that is also a gift. The knowledge that your daughter is safe, that the threat against her has been destroyed, and that the price of her safety was a wound in your own soul that will never fully close. Reese got a dog. A mutt, brown, floppy-eared, too big for his apartment, completely untrainable, from the same shelter where his ex-girlfriend had left his first dog 4 years ago. He named the dog Jennings, after the rider who'd walked through gunfire at the mill with his hands up and his voice steady, because Reese believed that the bravest things in the world deserved to be named after each other. The dog slept on his bed, ate his shoes, and destroyed 1 couch cushion per month. And for the first time in 4 years, Reese stopped rolling the quarter across his knuckles because his hands were too busy scratching a dog's belly. He never mentioned this to anyone. But Grimm noticed, the way Grimm noticed everything, and he said nothing because some healings are too fragile to survive acknowledgement. Victor Hale was convicted on 43 federal counts, including conspiracy, racketeering, evidence tampering, assault, and accessory to murder. His sentence was 37 years. He entered the federal correctional facility in a transport van on a Tuesday morning in March, and the last thing he saw before the gates closed was the sky. Gray, flat, ordinary. And he looked at it with the expression of a man who understood that he would never stand under an open sky again. The Creston Avenue Depot was not demolished. After the case became public, the city council, newly elected, aggressively transparent, designated it a historical site. Locker 218 was preserved as part of a permanent exhibit documenting the Meridian case, displayed behind glass in the town's small civic museum alongside the financial ledger, the photographs, and a plaque that read, "Evidence preserved by Tom Everett, building inspector." His records exposed a criminal conspiracy that had operated for 15 years. He did not survive to see justice served, but his work did. Grimm stood in front of that plaque once, on a Saturday afternoon when the museum was nearly empty. He read it twice. He thought about Tom Everett, a man he'd never met, a man who'd kept paper records because he didn't trust digital, a man who'd believed that evidence mattered and had been right, but not soon enough. He left the museum and rode west. No destination, just road, just wind, just the engine beneath him and the white line unspooling ahead and the particular silence of a man who has done the thing he set out to do and is now figuring out who he is without a mission to define him. 6 months after the trial, on a morning in early spring when the air smelled like wet earth and new growth and the faintest trace of something that might have been hope, Grimm stopped at a diner. Not Glass House, not the Rusted Spoke, a new place on a stretch of highway he hadn't ridden before, in a town he didn't know. The kind of place with a bell on the door and a counter with stools and a waitress who called everyone Han without irony. He sat in a booth by the window, ordered coffee and eggs and toast, ate slowly. Watched the parking lot fill with the ordinary traffic of ordinary lives. Minivans and work trucks, and a school bus that stopped at the corner and released a cascade of children who scattered across the sidewalk like marbles from a jar. The bell on the door rang. Noah walked in. Taller now. 3 inches, maybe 4. His hair was longer. The bruise on his jaw was gone. Completely. Finally. Not even a shadow remaining. He wore a jacket that fit and shoes that weren't held together with tape, and the expression of a boy who'd spent the past 6 months learning what it felt like to wake up in a house where no one was hunting him. Behind him, Lena. Taller, too, or maybe just standing straighter. The posture of a young woman who'd testified before a grand jury and walked out the other side and discovered that the world, while still broken, was at least broken in directions she could navigate. Grim didn't stand. He set his coffee down and watched them approach. And the thing he felt wasn't surprise, because he'd been expecting this without knowing he was expecting it. The way you sometimes know a storm is coming not because you see the clouds, but because the air changes. Noah slid into the booth across from him. Lena sat beside her brother. "How'd you find me?" Grim asked. "Reese," Noah said. "He said you always ride west on Saturdays. He said if I picked the right diner, you'd show up eventually." "Reese talks too much." "Reese is nice. He showed me his dog." "The dog that eats furniture?" "Jennings only ate 1 cushion while I was there." Noah smiled. It was a real smile, full, unguarded. The smile of a child who had relearned the mechanics of trust through the slow, patient process of being surrounded by people who didn't leave. "He's a good dog." Lena flagged the waitress and ordered coffee. When it arrived, she wrapped her hands around the mug the same way Grim did. Both palms, fingers laced, absorbing the heat. She noticed the mirror and smiled, and it was a small, private smile, the kind that forms when you recognize a habit you've inherited from someone you chose, rather than someone you were born to. "I start a new semester next month," she said. "Criminal justice. They offered me an internship with the county prosecutor's office." "Good. It doesn't pay." "Good things rarely do." "That sounds like something someone's grandfather would say." "I'm 41. Like I said." Grim almost laughed. The sound got halfway out and stopped, not because it wasn't real, but because it was. And real laughter, the kind that comes from a place that's been sealed shut for years, needs a moment to find its way through the rust. Noah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. He set it on the table between them. The brass key. It sat on the formica surface, catching the morning light through the diner window. It was clean now, polished, the blood gone, the tarnish removed, the engraving sharp and legible. Locker 218. Just a key. Just brass and teeth and an engraving. No blood, no secret, no weight that a boy shouldn't carry. "No more blood," Noah said. Grim looked at the key, at the boy, at the girl beside him, at the morning light falling across a diner table in a town he'd never visited, where the coffee was hot and the eggs were good, and the bell on the door rang every few minutes with the sound of people arriving to start ordinary days. He picked up the key, felt the brass, warm now, from Noah's pocket, from the heat of a child's body, from the simple, irreducible warmth of a hand that had held it, not as evidence or as burden, but as memory. As proof that a scared boy had once done a brave thing, and the world, for once, had responded. He closed Noah's fingers back around it. "No," he said. "Now it's just a key that opened the truth." Noah looked at the key in his hand, then at Grim, then at Lana, who was watching her brother with an expression that contained everything. The terror of the depot, the pain of the apartment, the loneliness of the doorways and dumpsters, and beyond all of it, past every dark thing that had happened. The steady, growing light of a life that was being rebuilt by people who had no obligation to rebuild it, but did it anyway, because that's what you do when the world breaks someone small, and you happen to have hands strong enough to help. "Keep it," Grim said. "Remind yourself what courage looks like. Because one day you'll need to be brave again, and when that day comes, you'll hold that key and remember that you already were." Noah put the key back in his pocket. He picked up a menu and studied it with the intense concentration of a boy who was choosing between pancakes and waffles, and the ordinariness of the decision, the magnificent, unspectacular ordinariness of it, was the most important thing that had happened in any of their lives in months. Grim drank his coffee. Lena drank hers. The waitress came back, and Noah ordered pancakes, and Lena ordered eggs, and Grim ordered another coffee because the first one was gone, and the morning was still young, and there was nowhere he needed to be except here, in this booth, in this diner, with these two people who had entered his life through violence and fear and were now sitting across from him in the quiet aftermath, eating breakfast like a family. Not a family by blood, not a family by law, a family by choice, assembled from wreckage, held together by the memory of a night when the rain fell and the guns fired and broken men on motorcycles rode toward a steel mill because two children needed them and nothing else mattered. Outside, the parking lot caught the morning sun. A Harley sat in the corner spot, its chrome reflecting the light in clean, bright lines. The engine was cool. It would be warm again soon. There were roads to ride, miles to cover, the long, unscripted distance of a life that continued beyond the crisis that had defined it. But not yet. Not this minute. This minute belonged to coffee and pancakes and the sound of a boy laughing at something his sister said, and the sound of that laughter filling a diner on a highway in a town that didn't know it was witnessing anything extraordinary. Just a man with scars on his hands sitting with two kids who looked at him like he was the safest thing in the world. Grim finished his coffee, set the mug down, looked out the window at the road stretching west into the sun. He wasn't the same man who'd stopped at a gas station and dropped his wallet. That man had been carrying a chain around his neck with a dead woman's key pressed against his heart, riding toward nothing, away from everything, filling the space between 2 points with engine noise and wind so he wouldn't have to hear the silence inside himself. This man had a phone with 3 numbers he answered without checking the screen, had a porch swing he'd oiled and rehung, had a shelf in his mother's kitchen where a boy's soup can still sat, rinsed and stacked, because some evidence of who passed through your life is worth preserving. The bell on the door rang. A family walked in. A mother, a father, 2 kids arguing about something trivial, the whole messy, imperfect machinery of ordinary love doing its ordinary work. Noah watched them. Then he looked at Grim, then at Lena, then back at his pancakes. "Can we come back here?" he asked. "Next Saturday?" Grim looked at the boy, at the question underneath the question, at the child who was really asking, "Is this permanent? Are you staying? Will you still be here when I need you?" "Yeah, Noah," he said, "we can come back." The morning widened, the sun climbed, and somewhere on a highway heading west, a line of motorcycles appeared on the horizon. Small at first, then growing, the sound of their engines reaching the diner parking lot like distant thunder, like a heartbeat, like the low and steady rumble of men riding toward something worth riding toward. They passed without stopping, but the sound lingered, carried by the wind, held by the road, absorbed by the walls of a diner where a man and 2 children sat together over empty plates and full cups, and the world outside was cold and imperfect and scarred by everything that had happened. But inside, for this one morning, it was warm, and it was enough, and no one was running anymore.